During the 2005 Consumer Electronics Show, the world was introduced to the latest display technology and the birth of Full HD 1080p in the living room. While Blu-ray and HD DVD movies were still more than a year away, this new standard promised unrivaled clarity, representing the true next generation of high-definition television. Months later, at E3 2005, Sony unveiled PlayStation 3 in what would go down as one of the most infamous press conferences in gaming history. And by the time the console launched in late 2006, it was clear that many of those original promises had not fully come to fruition. Although the console would eventually find success, its beginnings were challenging. One of the key marketing points leading up to the release of PlayStation 3, however, was the promise of Full HD 1080p support for both games and movies. As we know now, however, such a high resolution was ultimately unattainable by most software. But surprisingly, this push was never completely abandoned, and 1080p games did indeed ultimately ship, but at what cost? So on this episode of DF Retro, we're taking a journey back through the PlayStation 3's library to discover and assess the games which did fully realize this 1080p dream. Over the course of this video, we'll check out more than 85 games running at or near 1080p, and rate each one on a scale of 1 to 1080p. Then at the end of the video, we'll determine which was the best year for 1080p gaming on PlayStation 3. As we explore the library, I'll be grouping games together by release year to help determine how well the system fared over the course of its lifetime. We won't cover every single 1080p game, but hopefully I can tackle most of them. So join me as we dive back into the first generation of Full HD gaming.
Meet the Cell broadband engine. It's the digital soul of the PlayStation 3. And though it may look like an ordinary microchip, it is the future. It all comes down to processing power. The faster you think, the more things you can think about. And that makes you smarter.
PlayStation 3 launched on November 17th, 2006 in North America with 14 disc-based games plus 2 additional PSN exclusives. Of these 16 launch games, 5 offered support for Full HD 1080p, but this was just the beginning. Before we dive into these games, however, we need some additional context, I think. So 1 year prior to the arrival of PlayStation 3, Microsoft was first to market with its next generation machine, the venerable Xbox 360. And this console had already defined expectations for next generation gaming with a slew of impressive releases, including the then brand new Gears of War, which handily demonstrated the capabilities of Unreal Engine 3 that would go on to dominate the generation. It was clear that Xbox 360 was truly a force to be reckoned with. But what the 360 did not offer out of the gate, however, was digital video output. Early 360 consoles were limited to analog video only, and while 1080p over component video is possible in select cases, the system did not initially support this option. Now in 2007, an HDMI capable version of the 360 was released, and 1080p was definitely on the table then. But when PS3 launched, no other console could boast true digital Full HD support. And I believe this is part of the reason why Sony focused so heavily on marketing 1080p. It was a differentiating factor. Problem is, the hardware itself didn't quite live up to expectations in terms of overall performance, and many early titles fell woefully short compared to similar games on Xbox 360. Launch titles such as Call of Duty 3 and Madden 07 both ran at half the frame rate of their 360 counterparts. I mean, just look at how awful Call of Duty 3 is on this system. Even small rooms like this trigger massive performance dips. It's dreadful. And this begs the question, was the PS3 just empty hype, or was there something more to it? It turns out the answer isn't so simple. So, as I mentioned earlier, the PS3 launched in North America with 5 games supporting 1080p output, 3 disc-based games, and 2 PSN titles. Also worth keeping in mind, if you see 1080p support on the back of the box, that doesn't necessarily mean it supports 1080p rendering. Many later PlayStation 3 games support upscaling from 720p or less. But before you even get to playing those games, the PS3 puts on a strong showing, with a true native 1080p dashboard featuring Sony's cross-media bar. The XMB had been used on PSP and certain other Sony products already, but the PS3 presents it at its best. It's super sharp, features pixel-perfect font rendering, and a smooth 60 frames per second update, along with plenty of neat features such as music visualizers, all presented at 1080p. The PS3 also famously supports Blu-ray disc playback. The first Blu-ray players had only become available in the summer of 2006, mind you, and it's clear that Sony wanted the PS3 to help drive the sale of Blu-ray movies, just as the PlayStation 2 did for DVD. But of course, new consoles are all about games, and the 5 1080p launch titles actually did make a decent case for high-resolution output on PS3. The most prominent example is almost certainly Namco's Ridge Racer 7. I recently produced an entire episode of DF Retro on this era of Ridge Racer specifically, but the key point here is that Ridge Racer 7 expands upon the work done on 360's Ridge Racer 6 from the following year. It features improved visuals, more content, and you guessed it, support for native 1080p at 60 frames per second. If you were lucky enough to have access to a 1080p display in 2006, this was a real treat. The higher resolution was stunning to behold. While it's true that it lacked anti-aliasing and PC gamers were already used to high resolutions, full 1080p was still very new for console gaming. I feel that Ridge Racer 7 is a perfect argument in favor of conservative rendering features targeting higher performance. Ridge Racer 7 uses completely baked lighting, static environments, and well-worn rendering techniques. It kept pixel shader usage to a bare minimum and avoids things such as cascaded shadow maps entirely, something that would come to dominate this generation. It's focused completely on creating a simple, clean image that runs smoothly, and I feel this is one of the key reasons it holds up so well today. The art design gels with the fast performance and crisp image quality perfectly. Performance-wise, Ridge Racer 7 holds up with a generally very stable performance during gameplay. 60 FPS is the target, and that's what you're going to get in most scenarios. That said, there are occasional fleeting moments where you can dip the frame rate for just a moment, usually when combined with the boost feature. But thankfully, it's a minor issue, and overall it holds up very well. Ridge Racer 7 remains one of the finest examples of 1080p 60 on PS3, thus it receives the coveted Full HD award, all 1080p's. Another key 1080p launch game then is, and I quote, NBA 07 Full HD 1080p. Look, it's right there on the box. Are you really going to argue with that? Yes, Sony's first sports game on PS3 already serves as a strong example of what's possible when keeping your rendering ambitions in check. Like Ridge Racer before it, NBA 07 aims to deliver a native 1080p presentation running at 60 frames per second. It even warns you on startup that you're gonna need a capable 1080p TV and suitable HDMI cable to experience it. NBA 07 is the product of Sony's San Diego studio then, which was also responsible for the long-running MLB The Show series. And while it's visually conservative to say the least, they did manage to include some visual features that I think elevated above what was possible on last generation machines. For starters, player models are reasonably detailed and manage to feature normal mapped uniforms. But more impressive is the fact that they all have cloth simulation. Now, by today's standards, it's rather quaint, but for 2006, the way the shorts and jerseys bounce around as the players take to the court is reasonably impressive. This is coupled with planar reflections used on the court surface, with the surface texture itself using shaders to realistically distort those reflections across the uneven wooden surface. It looks pretty good, I think. Beyond this, the crowd is comprised entirely of fully animated polygonal models, which lends the game a more authentic atmosphere, and in the far distance, they even use depth of field, which both reduces aliasing and improves the cinematic nature of the presentation. Even the game's UI is rendered beautifully with full HD artwork everywhere that matches those visuals. It looks really shockingly good for the time. The caveat here is that performance is not 100% flawless. It does manage to stick to 60 frames per second most of the time, but you're gonna run into dips when the camera moves in certain positions, and that can be a little jarring. If you switch the game to 720p, however, all of these issues are cleaned up, but by then you've defeated the entire point of the game's subtitle. It's no longer full HD. So while NBA 07 is a convincing argument for 1080p 60 overall and an impressive launch game, the minor performance issues and occasional unflattering angles means a lower score than Ridge Racer. Thus, I give NBA 07 900 Ps out of 1080. One thing to note at this point in the video though, unlike the 360, PS3 doesn't automatically scale games to the desired output. You see, back in 2006, many HD TVs only offered support for 480p and 1080i input. 720p was not supported. The issue is that PS3's hardware scaler could only scale on one axis, the horizontal. So as a result, 720p games that did not offer 1080i or 1080p support would end up running at 480p on these displays instead. In the case of games which offer 1080p support, however, this also unlocks 1080i support for these TVs. Yes, it was frustrating and confusing at the time for many owners, but unfortunately, that's how it was early on. But the next real 1080p launch game then was one of the first downloadable PlayStation games ever released, and that's Blast Factor. It just so happens that this release is the very first game from Bluepoint Games, and it's a completely original one at that. Humble beginnings and all that, I suppose. So this is a twin-stick shooter with an interesting twist. You pilot a small craft through infected cells, so to speak, clearing these cells of infection as you go. Your path through each stage varies based on your performance, leading to various branching paths reminiscent of Darius from Taito. It also features motion control, allowing you to rapidly tilt the arena in one direction, causing viral particles to capsize in the process. And yes, as you can see, this one also supports Full HD 1080p running at 60 frames per second. While simple, the clarity and fluidity of the experience is impressive to behold even now. The number of particles and the interactive fluid sim really elevate this experience, and honestly, if you release this today on a modern machine as a result of its simple art design, I think it would still hold up. Thus, this one gets 1000 Ps out of 1080. It's not quite on the level of Ridge Racer owing to its smaller scale, but what's here is very polished and impressive for a launch game. A sharp beginning for Bluepoint Games. But we'll be seeing them again later in this video. Our next 1080p game just happens to be the other downloadable PSN title that was available at launch, and it's called Cash Guns Chaos. I'll be honest, this is one of those games that I've never heard a single person ever discuss since launch day. It is basically a Smash TV clone at its core, but the art direction is, well, not especially attractive, I think. But I will give them some credit. The developers really went for it when it comes to resolution and frame rate. Like our last three games, Cash Guns targets 1080p native at 60 frames per second, and by and large, it delivers. It looks ugly as heck while doing so, mind you, but hey, it still reaches that target. That said, the performance is not 100% flawless, and it can exhibit drops in performance from time to time, but still. I'll be generous and give this one 714 Ps out of 1080. It hits the target, but the game is highly constrained and ultimately rather unattractive, so it can't play with the big boys. Honestly though, when you look at these first few titles, you could almost believe Sony's marketing when it comes to native 1080p rendering on the PS3. Each of these games targets true native 1080p at 60 FPS, and all of them manage to hold up today as a result of smart, though conservative, visual choices. Everything seems great thus far. That is, until you load up our next game. But first, it's time for a commercial break. This is Marvel's Ultimate Alliance, our fourth and final 1080p launch game for PS3, and as you can see, it's kind of a mess. So, Ultimate Alliance is the creation of Raven Software and was developed using Vicarious Vision's Alchemy engine. It first arrived in October across multiple platforms, including Xbox 360, the PC, PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, and PSP. The PS3 iteration, though, would launch a few weeks later alongside the new console. Now, the Xbox 360 version was the best looking of the bunch at launch, and the PS3 version is derived from it. The main difference is that PS3 supports native 1080p output. Unfortunately, it does not run well in this mode. As you can see, it averages out to roughly 20 frames per second, but often dips below that, going as low as 12 FPS in heavy sequences, and this is just the beginning of the game, mind you. For a title played from an overhead perspective with a significant amount of lateral motion, this renders the game nearly unplayable in my book. It feels awful to play. Here's the thing though, you can reduce the rendering resolution of the game by selecting different resolutions at the system level, and 720p is dramatically faster, more in line with the 360 original, while 480p is even better. Problem is, if you're using a 1080i TV, you would have been stuck with the same lousy performance as the 1080p mode if using HD output, so you were probably stuck with 480p. So what the heck is going on here? I can only offer some guesses, but let's try. As a first generation game, it's likely that Ultimate Alliance is not deeply multi-threaded, and it likely leans heavily on the RSX, the PlayStation 3's GPU from Nvidia. As we know, the PS3 is heavily bottlenecked by the RSX, which is less performant than the ATI chip used in Xbox 360, and many early generation ports reflect this. The secret to speedy performance on PS3 lies in the cell processor and its SPUs. As we know, many GPU-centric tasks could be offloaded to SPUs, but in 2006 it was still early days for this. Now, Ultimate Alliance makes use of many visual features that would become staples of this generation. Per-pixel lighting, normal maps, dynamic shadows, and more advanced particles. It looks pretty good, I suppose, for the time, but I believe it serves as a cautionary flag for troubled waters ahead, demonstrating what we could expect during the first couple years of PS3 multi-platform development. As a result, I give Ultimate Alliance a mere 200 Ps out of 1080. The fact that it's a launch title means that it deserves some credit, but it remains one of the worst examples of 1080p performance on the PlayStation 3. Beware. So at launch, it's fair to say that while things were looking pretty good from certain perspectives, games such as Ultimate Alliance and Call of Duty 3 served as evidence that something was awry with PlayStation 3 that would begin to rear its head more and more going forward. Remember, the PS3 was widely considered more powerful than Xbox 360 when it launched, but reality started to catch up with it and it wasn't quite so cut and dried in the end. These were not the only 1080p titles available in 2006, however. 3 other games released before the year was through. 2 of these games are available as downloads via PSN, and of those, one of them was free. I'm talking about Gran Turismo HD. This small downloadable demo features 1 track with a limited amount of content and basically served as a demonstration of what Polyphony Digital had hoped to achieve on PlayStation 3, much as they did with GT 2000 on the PS2. Of course, little did they know that the road to release for the actual Gran Turismo 5 would be so long and so painful, but this was just the beginning. What makes this release so interesting though is that it's the first 1080p title to not quite reach 1080p. What I mean is, the game does not render its visuals at full 1920 by 1080, rather it targets 1440 by 1080 during gameplay. Yes, as mentioned before, PS3's scalers seem to only support single axis scaling on the horizontal, so developers had the option to aim for a higher resolution than 720p without needing to render full 1920 by 1080. The result is an image that is naturally less crisp than full HD, but at the same time, we're still seeing games today released on modern platforms such as the Switch or even last generation consoles with resolutions lower than this, so in that sense, it's pretty good for 2006. Furthermore, while GT HD's environments are derived from work done on GT4 for PlayStation 2, they've added an HDR rendering pipeline to the mix, more advanced shadow rendering, and dramatically improved car models with higher quality reflections and shading. Plus, the car selection screen does actually reach full native 1080p, so you can really appreciate that leap in detail that was possible. Thus, GT HD earns 800p's out of 1080. It looks and runs well, but it's not true native 1080p either, so it falls behind our first 3 native titles on this list. The other digital game available during this period though is Tekken Dark Resurrection Online, a PS3 conversion of the System 256 arcade game. This hardware is of course based on the PlayStation 2 architecture, meaning that it's one of the first examples of an HD remaster released during this generation. I'm not talking about games that were released across multiple generations. HD re-releases would become increasingly common in time, but Tekken was here almost at launch, delivering gorgeous 1080p 60 visuals. Unlike Ridge Racer 7, however, the assets are still those that were used in the arcade game, but there are some key improvements. Characters now feature self-shadows, for instance. There has been some debate over the resolution as well, but it does appear to retain full 1920 by 1080. It's just that certain stages employ a post-processing effect inherited from the arcade game, which can soften the output. Performance-wise, there's really not much to say here. The frame rate is 60 frames per second, just as advertised, and I was unable to find even a hint of slowdown throughout. Furthermore, the loading times are extremely quick. Ultimately, I give Tekken 900p's out of 1080. It's derived from prior generation hardware, but it does deliver a perfect 1080p 60 experience, so that counts for something. Thus far though, the games that have successfully delivered 1080p at 60 frames per second have largely avoided using then modern rendering features, or at least sticking to very light usage. The PS3 was clearly capable of reaching 1080p under certain circumstances, but you weren't pushing cutting-edge visuals while doing so. I think this sort of supports the notion of it being a design choice then. Developers that targeted 1080p needed to make certain that the choice was made early on in order to keep their visual targets in check on the way to the finish line. Which is why the next game is so interesting, because it's an example of what happens when you fly too close to the sun, so to speak. This is Full Auto 2 Battle Lines, a sequel to Full Auto for the Xbox 360 that had been released earlier in 2006. That's right, they released a sequel in less than 1 year. Crazy stuff. The thing is, Full Auto 2 is a marked improvement over that original in many ways, at least when using the right visual settings. But there's a problem here. If you're using the 1080i or 1080p mode, you're in for a bad time. You see, the developers not only opted for full HD 1080p rendering in this mode, they also enabled 4x multi-sampling anti-aliasing, or MSAA, surprisingly high texture filtering, and high-res particle effects, while building a game that features loads of destructibles and then modern rendering features. Needless to say, the PlayStation 3 does not tolerate this well, and the game's performance is frankly abysmal. It averages around 24 frames per second, which, is highly cinematic, but it still manages to dip below this point. For a racing game, this just doesn't cut it. Image quality is shockingly clean though, resembling what you might expect from a high-end PC game of this era. While combating the enemies though, there is also a way to combat the frame rate drops, and that's by selecting either 480p or 720p from the XMB. The rendering resolution is then reduced and performance is massively boosted. Now, it's still wildly unstable, mind you. There's no frame rate cap, so it can go above 30 for instance, but it's a lot more playable. 720p is the sweet spot, I'd say, but if you drop all the way to 480p, performance improves even further. So, like Marvel before it, this is another case where the user needs to be aware of their video settings in order to properly enjoy the game. As a result, this one only gets 512p's out of 1080. It's not nearly as bad as Ultimate Alliance, but still, it has some serious problems in 1080p. But with that release out of the way, we've reached the end of 2006 and the first month of PlayStation 3's life. At the end of each year then, we'll tally up the full HD scores, divide by the number of 1080p games that year, and present this, the grand total. This means that 2006 earns 763 Ps out of 1080. And at the end of this video, we'll determine the best year for 1080p in the history of the PlayStation 3. So, let's keep moving. What does 2007 hold for the system? Let's find out.
The world is our stage, and we are the entertainment. Blu-ray to make everything more beautiful.
2007 is perhaps the PlayStation 3's most difficult year, but also one of its most interesting. The console would finally arrive in Europe in March of 2007 with revised consoles lacking hardware support for PlayStation 2 backwards compatibility, relying instead on a partial software solution. But hey, at least the lineup of games was a lot better. More importantly, on March 13th, 2007, the world was introduced to Chad Warden.
Sup, b****s? It's Chad Warden here. Alright, I'm talking about that PS Triple. The PS Triple. I ain't talking about that Wii. That Wii shit. People will be talking about how it's all new and shit. But you know what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say is that, come on now, Wii.
Needless to say, Chad only accepts that which satisfies ABAP. You know, as ballin' as possible. So obviously, the push for 1080p would continue, with more than a dozen games released capable of full HD. But as you might expect, most of these games remain rather conservative when it comes to pushing technology. Even still, I would classify it as true ABAP. It begins with the release of NBA Street Home Court in February, a game which marks, as I'd like to call it, the year of 1080p. The reason? Well, not only does this game support 1080p native output on PlayStation 3, it's also the first official game to support 1080p on Xbox 360. Of course, years later I discovered that the Quake 2 bonus disc included with Quake 4 also offered native 1080p support at the launch of Xbox 360, but it was never marketed as such and the system didn't even support 1080p at the time. It was kind of a hidden option. So what does 1080p buy you in NBA Street? Well, it does indeed deliver a crisp, clean presentation. The game looks really sharp at 1080p, even on both consoles. But unfortunately, there's a catch: the frame rate. You see, on both systems, engaging the 1080p mode basically halves the frame rate. I say basically since it does seem to be using a double buffer VSync setup, meaning that at times you'll notice the game spike up to 60 frames per second for a brief moment before dropping back down to 30. It's a tricky one in that sense. The game is perfectly playable at 30 frames per second, but it definitely benefits from a greatly increased frame rate, which is precisely what's possible when selecting 720p instead. Yes, like several other games on this list, the rendering resolution varies based on which option you select at your system level. 720p delivers a much smoother 60 frames per second experience, but you of course lose some clarity in the process. It still qualifies as an EA HD game, I suppose, but it's certainly not full HD anymore. More interesting perhaps is the difference in image quality between PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. While the PS3 version is fairly well optimized, this is another example where 360 takes the lead. Specifically, PS3 has no anti-aliasing at all, while Xbox 360 features 4x MSAA, leading to an image that looks so clean that it's beyond many PlayStation 4 and Xbox One games even. Still, aside from this, the game looks otherwise identical between the two platforms, and honestly it's a fantastic looking title all around. Smooth animation work, excellent reflections, where appropriate at least, strong lighting, and visual design. It's basic stuff, but it looks fantastic. I'll be honest, I actually skipped this game back in the day and only picked up a cheap copy for this video. but I was instantly surprised by how playable and fun it really is. It's basically EA Big's own take on the NBA Jam concept, with more of a street ball vibe and 3 players per side instead. It controls super well and has a fantastic sense of style and a nice soundtrack. The whole menu system and all the graphic design is just fantastic, and believe it or not, all of this was made using Flash. So when it comes to rating this one, I'm going with 850 out of 1080p's. The visual style and image quality pushes it towards the top, but obviously the hit to frame rate means it can't stand up to the best on this list. While we're talking NBA, how about a little bit of NBA 08? Santa Monica returns with its second basketball game, and it's largely the same as 07. And it is clearly a continuation of the technology featured in NBA 07 Full HD 1080p. And of course, it's still native 1080p, and it's still 60 frames per second. I respect their dedication to Full HD at a time when most other competing sports titles opted for lower resolutions. But unfortunately, they axed the depth of field effect from that original game, which I feel is a step down in terms of overall visual quality. A minor thing, but a loss nonetheless. Given that this is a later release and it loses some of the visual fidelity of the first game, I have to drop the score slightly to 850p's out of 1080. It is still surprisingly solid though. Next up then is something completely different. Released in February 2007 on PlayStation 3, this is Flow from That Game Company. While TGC has become well known for its later game, Journey, it all begins here with Flow. On the surface, it's visually simplistic, but it also offers a design language that really showcases what's possible with an HD display, which I guess is the point. So the basic idea here involves using motion control to manipulate various underwater creatures of sort. You swim around eating anything in your path, slowly growing and evolving in the process. Throughout the game, you'll run across these blue or red objects, and eating these will send you up or down a level, respectively. So progress involves growing and slowly making your way deeper into the watery depths. It's moody and engaging. What I love about the presentation though is the reliance on depth of field to communicate the depths below. The active playfield is always razor sharp, but everything below is obscured by this layer of depth of field blur, which looks really great in motion. Couple this with a generally smooth frame rate and swirling particles, and you have a memorable visual experience. Flow takes advantage of 1080p displays by rendering from a higher resolution then. It seems to render at 1440p internally, downscaling to lower resolutions including 1080p, so it's basically relying on super sampling to achieve its image quality. Now, the frame rate can dip slightly in certain later stages, unfortunately, but the overall experience is fluid by and large. As a result, I award Flow 950p's out of 1080. The slowdown and simplistic design keeps it from the very top, but it's still remarkably solid. Then, just a few weeks later on March 8th, 2007, Sega and Sumo Digital unleashed a home port of Virtua Tennis 3, and this one is awesome. Now, I'm a huge fan of Virtua Tennis, and this third iteration is no exception. It's one of the most satisfying and responsive tennis games in the market, and is packed with content. Virtua Tennis 3 stems from the then new generation of Sega arcade games built around the Lindbergh hardware that also powered other titles such as Virtua Fighter 5. Unlike VF5 however, Virtua Tennis 3 supports Full HD 1080p output on both home consoles, making it one of the sharpest looking games available. Yes, this is another one available on both PS3 and the Xbox 360. More importantly, it retains a smooth 60 frames per second update, at least during gameplay. These interstitial scenes do run less smoothly of course, much like the original Naomi game, but the gameplay itself is buttery smooth. This is the second game to run at 1080p on both the 360 and PS3 then, but this time, they're basically identical in terms of image quality as they both utilize 2x MSAA. With the quality of its presentation and beautiful visual design then, Virtua Tennis 3 is our second game on the list to win the coveted Full HD award, scoring a full 1080 out of 1080. Nice work, Sumo Digital. But of course, 2007 is just getting started. Up to this point, when showcasing its most recent PlayStation consoles, Sony loved to wheel out a demo featuring ducks toying about in the water. And on PS3, they finally turned this concept into a real game with Super Rub-a-Dub. And this game shares something with GT HD, which I mentioned earlier. Specifically, it supports 1080p output, but runs at a resolution below native 1080p. Specifically, it runs at 1600 by 1080 rather than a full 1920 by 1080. In action, however, the result is surprisingly good. The game looks sharp and feels suitably high res, even if it's not quite as crisp as other games on this list. I'm including it here though, as it's another early example of horizontal scaling on the PS3. Still, the aesthetic holds up in motion, and it updates at a smooth 60 frames per second, while featuring a reasonably robust fluid simulation that has water sloshing about as you guide your rubber ducks to the exit. Like Flow, this one also uses motion control, and it works pretty well. The further we delve into the 1080p library on PS3 though, the more it's clear how showing restraint in terms of visual design is really the key to delivering a smooth game at a resolution this high. And I'll be honest, I'd rather play something at 1080p 60 with simplistic visuals like this than a game running at like 600p at 20 FPS, which is unfortunately something we saw often on the PS3. So what about the score? Well, I'm giving this one 750 Ps out of 1080. While I appreciate the simple design, GT HD does have an edge over this one, and of course it's not a true native 1080p, so it has to lose some points, despite the fluid performance. Our next game then is one that has been seemingly forgotten over the years by most players, but I've always had a soft spot for it. I'm talking about Calling All Cars. Created by Incognito Entertainment, known for Twisted Metal, Calling All Cars is their first smaller scale downloadable game. The idea? It's basically basketball in cars with weapons and a criminal instead of a ball. Kind of like NBA Jam meets Twisted Metal, I suppose. You drive around Twisted Metal-like maps trying to snatch up your target, then deposit them into the nearest jail cell. There's usually multiple points to deposit your prisoner as well, and you gain more points for hitting those more challenging goals. The whole thing has this old school tune vibe that I like, and yeah, it runs at a full 1080p at 60 frames per second. I used to bring this game along when testing HD TVs back in 2007 actually. Its sharp, simple visual design really pops at 1080p. It uses cel shading combined with seemingly hand-drawn textures to create its cartoony world. And as with so many other PS3 games targeting 1080p 60 FPS, it's not pushing any new visual techniques. It's certainly not a technical powerhouse. But I do feel it is one of the best examples yet in terms of dialing in a strong, distinct visual style that is just conservative enough to run smoothly on the PS3 at this resolution. With that in mind, Calling All Cars receives 1040 Ps out of 1080, falling just short of the top, simply because it doesn't quite stack up to Ridge Racer 7 or Virtua Tennis 3. Our next game though is something truly special. It's Super Stardust HD from Housemarque, and it remains one of the best games they've ever made, in my opinion at least. It's basically a new take on the classic Amiga shooter which they made back in the day, and it looks and plays like a dream. So this one was released first in June 2007, but here's the thing. At launch, Stardust HD ran at just 1280 by 1080, making it our lowest 1080p title yet. That is until a later date when the game was updated to support 3D TVs, and Housemarque managed to boost the resolution to a full native 1920 by 1080 in 2D mode. Yep, this is a fantastic example of what's possible when a developer learns new tricks over the course of a generation. You see, to deliver the game in 3D, they basically had to run it at an effective 120 FPS, or 60 frames per second per eye, but at a lower resolution. This extra headroom made it possible to both double the split screen frame rate to 60 and boost the resolution in 2D mode. Cool, right? And yeah, it's a complete success story. The game delivers razor-sharp 1080p visuals at a full 60 frames per second with tons of particles, lights, and explosions. 1080p means the transparent geometric grid surrounding each planet is now mostly devoid of aliasing, while the strong contrast between the out-of-focus backdrops and the crisp foreground is enhanced further. Even when the action heats up, the game manages to retain a very steady frame rate, which, combined with the stellar visuals and art direction, means that this game holds up very well even today. It fully deserves the prestigious Full HD award, just like Ridge Racer 7 and Virtua Tennis 3 before it. There's little doubt, Housemarque knew what it was doing. So we're halfway through 2007 thus far, and looking pretty good. 5 of the 6 games we've covered thus far run at true native 1080p, and a different 5 games also run at 60 frames per second. Unsurprisingly, the games skew more towards either sports or simple downloadable games. But our next game is perhaps something completely different than anything we've discussed thus far.
Civilizations is in your hands. Lair. Rated T for teen. Only on PlayStation 3.
This is the now infamous Lair, created by Factor 5, a game which unfortunately cost the studio dearly, but I feel from a modern perspective at least, it deserves a second appraisal. It is effectively a pseudo-sequel to the Star Wars Rogue Squadron games. Like Rogue Squadron, it focuses on aerial missions set across various regions, and the basics of combat are extremely familiar, in a good way. Problem is, at launch, Sony wanted the game to become a showcase for the system's motion control feature, something Factor 5 was seemingly not too keen on according to various interviews. Furthermore, the initial review build that went out to press was even less polished in this regard than the final game, leading to less than stellar review scores. Following its release though, Factor 5 went on to update the game with new options including support for analog controls and even the addition of a Rogue Squadron style reticle. But alas, it was too little, too late, and the game was doomed. Back in the day though, I did manage to have some fun with those motion controls. They're honestly not bad, but certain moves, such as the 180 turn, were difficult to execute and it could become frustrating as a result. The addition of analog controls mostly solves this, leading to a more enjoyable combat experience all around. Beyond this, the actual missions are pretty ambitious and large in scope, with so much happening on screen. It felt like a massive leap over what we had already seen in the impressive Rogue Squadron games in that sense. Beyond that, Lair has a superb musical score. Take a listen. And many of its missions are dripping in atmosphere. Flying around spotlights at night during a thunderstorm is never not appealing. So how does it fare visually then? Well, expectations were high for this game, of course, and the team delivered in many aspects, but it also falls short in others. Basically, in terms of image quality, Lair is technically our lowest resolution game discussed yet today, but its approach is fascinating. Essentially, it runs at 800 by 1080 per frame with multi-sampling anti-aliasing, but it merges the AA buffers to temporally double the horizontal resolution. So it's kind of a pseudo 1600 by 1080 image. It's surprisingly effective in that sense. So while it's not a full 1080p, of course, it still looks a lot sharper than 720p would. Unfortunately, there's a huge caveat here, and that's the performance. The frame rate is disappointingly low throughout. It aims for 30 frames per second, but regularly drops below this point, leading to a somewhat choppy experience in the end with plenty of screen tearing. It's clear that the scope of the environments combined with the chaos is just a little too much for the PS3, and the heavy reliance on screen-filling alpha effects taxes the RSX. There is a solution, however. Switching your console all the way down to 480p solves most of the performance issues at the expense of clarity, but then you're no longer at 1080p, are you? Lair is a step up from games like Full Auto 2 and Ultimate Alliance when it comes to performance, of course, but it's still not great. In the end, Lair scores 675 Ps out of 1080. It's ambitious and beautiful in many ways, but the screen tearing and low performance are distracting, and the pixel count is ultimately a ways off from delivering that true 1920 by 1080 image. It's a game that feels like it needed some extra time and development to really shine, but even still, I recommend giving it a second chance. Following the release of Lair, however, 2 more 1080p 60 games would arrive in September of that year: Pixel Junk Racers and Loco Roco Kokorecho. I'm grouping these 2 games together as both offer a similar performance and visual profile. Pixel Junk Racers marks the first entry in the Pixel Junk series from Q Games, the studio founded by the legendary Dylan Cuthbert. It's perhaps the least ambitious game in the series, but still well worth checking out. It basically combines slot car racing with various objectives. This includes anything from aiming for maximum speed while avoiding other vehicles to basic racing, and a whole lot more actually. We're looking at the updated version of the game here, I should note, but it looks the same. The game benefits a lot from native 1080p by offering a zoomed out perspective of the track with little tiny cars. It's almost like peering out across a real slot car track in that sense, at least from a distance. The high resolution allows the game to maintain a nice level of detail even with the camera situated far above the track. Unsurprisingly, it has zero issues maintaining a flawless 60 frames per second at all times. It's not technically ambitious or anything, but it makes smart use of its available technology. Loco Roco then is completely different. It's a game derived from the amazing PSP titles, but presented as more of a puzzle game. You guide a butterfly cursor around the screen while trying to collect and manipulate the Loco Rocos. The game takes place on a large map with gated sections that require X number of Loco Rocos to continue. It's not as direct or fun as the PSP games, I might say, but it's still an enjoyable little romp that features the same great musical madness you'd expect from the series. Targeting 1080p 60 allows for a pristine presentation with beautiful colored shapes vibrantly bouncing around as you explore the map. Like Pixel Junk Racers, it also locks to 60 frames per second with ease and looks great while doing so. As a result, I'd like to award both games 1020 Ps out of 1080. While unambitious visually, they each perfectly execute what they set out to achieve without any technical hiccups along the way. While we're on the topic of smaller scale titles then, another 1080p game worth mentioning is Everyday Shooter. Released in early October of 2007, just in time for autumn, Everyday Shooter is kind of an important release in that it's one of the earliest games in the indie movement of this era. I suppose the same could be said of Flow as well, but releasing a small solo indie project on a major console in 2007 was kind of a big deal, something that we'd see a lot more of as the generation progressed. Either way, it's a cool little game. It started out on the PC before the PlayStation 3 version, but it's much improved in terms of overall presentation and feel. It's basically a musical shooter where each stage is a unique song with its own combo system. It's fun, simple, and clean with a super sharp native 1080p presentation. It's another game that could still be released on Steam right now, and it wouldn't feel out of place. That said, it's not quite as fluid as our last 2 games, so I'd give this one 980 Ps out of 1080. But our next game is, well, take a look. Just 1 year prior, Disney and Pixar unleashed Cars into theaters, and it quickly became one of the most popular films in Pixar history. So of course, they had to cash in on this with a game, right? Enter Cars Mater National Championship, the greatest game of the generation. It has Lightning McQueen, it has Mater, it has racing. It's basically Forza Horizon before Forza Horizon. And, okay, well, I'm kinda teasing here, but honestly, it's a whole lot better than I expected. So firstly, it's developed by Rainbow Studios. You know, the developer behind the ATV Off-Road Fury games on PlayStation 2, among many others, I should note. I love Rainbow's work, and somehow missed that they were involved with this project. Of course, we're talking about the PS Triple version here, which was actually made by Incinerator Studios, and this of course runs at Full HD 1080p. Yep, this one is a true 1920 by 1080 game as well, but this time with Quincunx MSAA. Remember that one? It's a lot like 2x MSAA with 2 geometry sample points, but also uses 3 samples from neighboring pixels, which results in a slight blurring of the image. So at its core, Cars Mater National lets players run loose around Radiator Springs, taking part in various events and races along the way. Again, kinda like Forza Horizon as we know today. It's surprisingly alright. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's a competent and fun racing game. Licensed movie games of this era were largely terrible, remember, so that's a real positive in its favor. So how does it fare tech-wise though? Well, there's basically 2 modes here, the native 1080p mode and a 720p mode. And the difference, aside from pixel count, lies entirely in frame rate. At 1080p, it's basically a 30 frames per second game with screen tearing, while 720p targets 60 instead. And that's pretty much it. In comparison, the Xbox 360 version is limited to 720p output, but with 4x MSAA. Now, the 1080p situation here is not optimal, as the tearing can prove rather intrusive, but it's still within the realm of playability and probably would have looked pretty sharp on a 1080p TV back in 2007. Thus, in the end, Cars Mater National scores 860 out of 1080. The hit to performance coupled with tearing knocks some points off the top, but what's here is honestly not half bad. By now though, we're closing in on the end of 2007 with just a couple more games to cover. The first one I want to mention briefly is the second Pixel Junk game, Pixel Junk Monsters. Releasing in Japan on December 6th, 2007, Monsters takes a similar visual cue from Racers in that it's a simple 2D game that leans on the clarity of Full HD output to improve its presentation. I think it makes a big difference here. Interpolating from lower resolutions often blurs and obscures the art, but Monsters is crisp and clean, and yes, it's fully 60 frames per second. Thus, I give this one 1020p's as well. But the last big game I want to talk about for the year 2007 is the Japanese release of Gran Turismo 5 Prologue. Yep, just 1 year after GTHD, Polyphony had something else to show. It's basically a larger scale demo that was sold at retail, kinda like those GT concept releases in Europe and Japan. This one features a multitude of tracks and events to race on, along with a much larger selection of vehicles, but it's still far from being that complete Gran Turismo experience. The final version of GT5 would not arrive for another 3 years or so at this point, keep in mind. Visually, however, it does feel like a proper leap from GTHD. The new tracks, especially London, are remarkably detailed and well designed, but this comes at a cost. The rendering resolution is reduced further down to 1280 by 1080, so it just barely qualifies as a 1080p experience as a result. That said, it does utilize 2x MSAA in this mode, so it looks reasonably sharp. If you opt for 720p, however, instead, you get 4x MSAA in comparison. This release is certainly unusual, however, given its distance from the final version of GT5, and in revisiting it, I feel like it does some things better. It generally feels quicker, the menus are faster, there's less loading, and it has a nice focus to it. It almost feels like their ambitions hadn't quite gotten away from them yet, and it's a nice bite-sized release. Keep in mind that Gran Turismo 5 Prologue arrived on PlayStation 3 at the same point in its lifespan as the PlayStation 2 when GT3 launched for that console. So performance is not flawless. It aims for 60 FPS of course, but doesn't always reach the target, and you will encounter mild screen tearing from time to time. So yeah, GT5 Prologue is an interesting taste of things to come, but demonstrates that Full HD 1920 by 1080 was never fully possible with visuals of this quality on the PlayStation 3. Thus, I award GT5 Prologue 775 Ps out of 1080. The visuals are more ambitious than GT HD, but the resolution and performance has been reduced, so it falls slightly below. Our very last game of 2007 though is a little less serious. It's something called Snakeball. It's a small scale little game, and I only have the trial version mind you, but basically it's a lot like Snake but with more collecting and shooting. It's a fun little game. It runs at 60 frames per second and delivers a pseudo 1080p image. That is, it runs at 1280 by 1080 like GT5 Prologue actually. I don't really have a lot more else to say about it, but I did want to squeeze it in here as this one's surprisingly not bad. Since it falls at the low end of 1080p though, and is rather constrained in its scope, I think it deserves 725 out of 1080. And our grand total for 2007 is 912 Ps out of 1080. A nice step up from the launch year. With that, however, we've reached the end of 2007. At this point, the results are in line with what I noted earlier. The PS3 is perfectly capable of 1080p 60 when the visual target is kept in check, but combining high-resolution rendering with the more ambitious visual features makes this difficult to impossible. Furthermore, while there are many interesting releases for PlayStation 3 in 2007, it was also a difficult year where both Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii seemed to dominate the conversation, and 360 typically had the advantage in terms of performance. In 2008, however, things would begin to improve for the PS Triple. As the calendar ticked over to the year 2008, the PS3 was already being sold for $100 less than its original $599 price, and some big titles were on the horizon, such as the much anticipated Metal Gear Solid 4. This is the year that Rumble was brought back to the PS3 after being absent from early 6-axis controllers. Furthermore, multi-platform development would begin to improve this year, with new games beginning to release with near parity against the 360. Of course, most of the heavy hitters that would arrive in 2008 did not strive for Full HD 1080p visuals and were more focused on pushing new technology. That doesn't mean there aren't some wonderful examples that would arrive, especially later in the year though. I should also stress that while I'm aiming to include as many games as possible in this video, I wasn't able to locate every single 1080p title, and not every game can be featured as a result. I had no intention of shelling out for a copy of 2008 World Series of Poker, which is supposedly 1080p. We'll just have to take their word on that one, I think. Furthermore, there are more than 2,500 games for PlayStation 3, and I'm sure there are 1080p titles hiding somewhere in that list that we didn't encounter. But enough of that, let's just get to the games, baby. Everybody knows PS3 make the best games, right? The first 1080p title for 2008 then is another release from EA Sports, FIFA Street 3. This is a solid game, but unfortunately it's also the final title to be released under the EA Sports big label that kicked off with SSX. A sad day indeed. So, FIFA Street 3 is very much the football version of NBA Street, I suppose. It delivers a more arcade-like experience rather than attempting to simulate the actual sport, which honestly is my preferred way to experience anything FIFA related. This one takes a page from NBA Street, and it might even share the same underlying technology in that it offers two modes, a native 1080p presentation and one at 720p. And just like NBA, the difference comes down to frame rate. In native 1080p mode, the game looks very sharp indeed, but it's limited to just 30 frames per second basically. And this time, I didn't notice any sudden lurches up to 60, so it feels a lot more stable overall. Of course, if you switch the console down to 720p, it does run a lot smoother and feel more responsive, so it's one of those cases where you kind of have to pick and choose what you value more. Stability and frame rate, or clarity. As best as I can tell though, this is pretty much the last EA Sports game to feature a full 1080p native presentation, with the focus shifting more towards 60 FPS at lower resolutions, though even that wasn't always guaranteed. So how does this fare in terms of the Full HD score then? Well, I'm going with 860p's this time, slightly above NBA Street, simply due to its more consistent frame rate. Of course, we're not done with sports just yet. Our next big release for 2008 is another first-party title. It's MLB 08 The Show. This is the second year for MLB The Show on PS3, and it offers a dramatically more complete and polished experience, feeling more like a proper PlayStation 3 game now. Remember, MLB 07 released 3 months after PS2 and PSP, while offering less than stellar visuals versus expectations. MLB 08, though, is a gigantic leap forward in comparison, and like NBA 07, it supports Full HD 1080p, but this time there are some caveats to consider, both in terms of visuals and performance. So for starters, if you have all the video options selected at the OS level, the game will default to 720p like this. And the reason is simple. The 720p mode offers enhanced visual effects such as depth of field, and it targets a higher frame rate. But surprisingly, it's not a steady 60 FPS at all. In fact, it's inconsistent, hovering primarily around the upper 50s. While this might be the intended way to play the game, I'd argue it's not really good enough, and it's definitely a disappointment for a sports game like this. If you want to experience MLB 08 in Full HD 1080p, however, you have an option. Simply uncheck the other options at the system level, and the game will boot in a native 1080p mode. The result, a 30 frames per second cap is used instead, and you know what? In this case, I kind of feel like it's a superior option, as it results in a far more consistent frame rate. The caveat here is, as mentioned earlier, you lose some of the post-processing effects that were present in the 720p mode, so the game doesn't look quite as nice. So while MLB 08 looks better than NBA 07 overall, the cost of performance is a little too steep for my liking, and thus it falls below NBA's 900 points for 815 instead. Perhaps next year the game will offer an improvement? Guess what though, Santa Monica wasn't done with the NBA just yet. This is NBA 09 The Inside, the final NBA game from the studio, and the last 1080p basketball game on PS3, or is it? So the game starts up proclaiming Full HD support, at least partially, but in reality, it's closer to 720p instead. Yeah, image quality takes a gigantic dip, with a much softer presentation all around. It's simply a case of upscaling from a lower resolution to 1080p than native 1080p rendering, as in the last two titles. Now you can see that the team did upgrade many aspects of the visuals and added a lot more to the overall package, and it does still run at 60 frames per second, but the Full HD nature of the game has been completely eliminated. From the visuals to the interface, this is not a Full HD game any longer. As a result, I can only realistically give this one 250 out of 1080. It's just not a true 1080p experience any longer, and is a general step back, but it gets some points just because it actually runs well. Next up, released in April and May respectively, we have 2 more native 1080p games aiming for a simple, clean visual style. The third Pixel Junk game, Eden, and Echochrome. Pixel Junk Eden features an even more minimalistic design language than the prior 2 Pixel Junk games, almost reminiscent of Loco Roco but with a deep, chilled vibe instead. What I love about Eden is the liveliness of its world. Everything moves and changes as you navigate each garden, and it all updates at a smooth, perfect 60 frames per second. With its abstract design and smooth performance, Pixel Junk Eden feels as fresh and beautiful today as it did in 2008. It's another example of design triumphing above all. Echochrome then is also interesting, and one of the cleanest looking games on this list. It's basically a puzzle game built on the concept of manipulating MC Escher-like artwork to reach your goal. By shifting the perspective, you create new paths for your character to navigate. It's kind of relaxing and a lot of fun in that sense. This one delivers native 1080p with what seems like 4x MSAA. Given that the game is entirely based around thin black lines, it's actually a perfect fit for MSAA, and the image is effectively flawless as a result. That said though, the frame rate is limited to just 30 frames per second rather than going for 60, which would have been nice, but honestly, It's not a huge deal in this case, as Echo Chrome is not a fast-paced action game. So how do these two games rate on the full HD scale? Well, Pixel Junk Eden scores 1025 out of 1080, slightly above the prior two Pixel Junk games due to its striking art direction. Echo Chrome, though, scores 990. It is razor sharp, but it's limited to just 30 frames per second. Still, both games are beautiful examples of artists delivering stellar 1920 by 1080 results on the PS Triple. Then in June, Capcom unleashed an unexpected HD sequel to the classic arcade games Commando and Mercs. It's Wolf of the Battlefield Commando 3, a clever title which combines the original Japanese name Senjo no Okami with the Western title Commando. This one was developed by Backbone Entertainment during the time when Capcom was tasking Western studios with revitalizing classic franchises. Some would be hugely successful, I might argue, such as the stunning Bionic Commando rearmed from Grin. But Commando 3 is honestly kind of a disappointment. Now, to be fair, it's a competent twin-stick shooter at its core, although I would say that with the original games not being twin-stick, I'm not sure this was 100% the right move, but I digress. The thing is though, is it does play reasonably well, even still. But it has a few issues with its presentation and game design. Specifically, the levels feel overly long and many of the encounters are somewhat dull, compared to what they should be. The biggest issue though stems from its visual design. I'm just not a fan of the way this game looks. It has a style that feels very much of that era, if you know what I mean, but it doesn't click for me at all. Compared to the gorgeous pixel art seen in those original games, it really is, again in my opinion, an ugly game. Of course, this was still before the revitalization of pixel art for classic rebirths, so everything had to be 3D, and Commando 3 is of course no exception. It does, however, offer players the option to play the game at native 1080p with 2x MSAA or 720p with 4x. It's very crisp and clean at 1080p especially, though the game is no less ugly even in high res. Unfortunately, playing at this resolution does have a downside, and that is performance. So this is another game that runs noticeably worse in its 1080p mode. We're not talking Ultimate Alliance here, but it regularly drops from its 60 FPS target, which combined with the unattractive art design leads to a game that never feels great in practice. If you want smoother performance, that 720p mode offers this as an option. So yeah, Commando 3 is an average revival of a classic series that feels outdated by today's standards, in a way that the original games do not. Thus, I'm giving this one exactly half, or 540 out of 1080, due to the double whammy of unappealing visual design and unstable 1080p performance. It's still a lot better than our previous worst games, but it's not where it should be. Unfortunately, if you're a fan of 1080p on the PS3, our next two games aren't going to do much for you either. The first one is Elefunk. It's a puzzle game that revolves around building bridges capable of supporting, well, elephants. Strange concept to be sure, but honestly it's not a bad idea, and it does have some value for sure. And yes, this one is indeed 1080p with 4x MSAA, so it's very, very clean. I'm not a huge fan of its visual design either, mind you, but it's functional and reasonably well suited to this specific type of game. It doesn't push any boundaries in terms of technology, though the physics stuff is kinda cool, but it makes the list either way. I don't have a lot to say about this one if I'm honest though, but I will hand it a nice 700 out of 1080 simply due to its pristine image quality. It loses points due to the somewhat dull visual design combined with the fact that it runs at just 30 frames per second though. The next one, however, is yet another Backbone developed Capcom Rebirth, this time with 1942 Joint Strike. It seems to share the same core technology as Commando 3 though, right down to the water shader used throughout. That said, due to its focus on planes rather than soldiers running around the battlefield, it actually winds up looking less ugly as a result. Now, it's not a beautiful game, mind you, but it's certainly an improvement in that regard, even if it kind of feels like something Phoenix Games might have produced on the PlayStation 2. I also feel this one plays somewhat better, feeling more like a combination of elements from various entries in the 1940X series or whatever. Unfortunately, it does share the same technical issues as Commando 3, namely, it's unstable when played in 1080p. The image quality is solid to be sure, but it just doesn't maintain the target frame rate, which is a big no-no for a vertical shooter. So I'm giving this one 580p's out of 1080. It's slightly better than Commando 3, but ultimately still a letdown. It walks this strange line between pushing some Gen 7 features, but failing to use them in a way that produces attractive results or even good performance. Don't worry though, we're almost to one of the best looking games on PlayStation 3, one that does aim for 1080p, but there's just one more game to talk about before we get to it, and it's rather unique.
Presented by Hindustan Electronic Company Limited.
नमस्ते আমি দ্য লাস্ট গাই का ডিরেক্টর আমার নাম সঞ্জয় দত্ত
This is The Last Guy, an overhead herding simulator where you run around aerial maps of cities all around the globe, saving people from hordes of zombies. What makes this one unique, aside from its bizarre marketing campaign, is the fact that it uses real satellite imagery pulled from Google Earth. At least that's what they say. And they use this data to create various cities. Yep, everything you see here is derived from real world imagery, and it is surprisingly neat and effective, I have to admit. As a result, it's a good match for native 1080p output, as you can zoom the camera all the way out while still retaining a suitable amount of clarity. This is also one of those cases where the visual design basically demands a high resolution screen. The characters are extremely small in this game. It would be very difficult to enjoy this at, say, 480p, I'd imagine. Unfortunately, the scrolling is updated at just 30 frames per second, so it doesn't feel as fluid as I feel it should. Still, this is one of those games that makes a strong case for 1080p at the time. It is relatively low tech, yes, but it works and it benefits the style of game that they've built. Thus, I give this one 825 out of 1080. Yes, these scores are getting a little bit crazy, aren't they? Thus far then, 2008 has pushed increasingly towards small-scale games, and sports of course. The 2D revolution had yet to begin, so 1080p games were increasingly less ambitious in 2008. But our next release is perhaps one of the very best games released on PlayStation 3. This is Wipeout HD, one of the smoothest, most beautiful games yet released for the console. A true showcase that manages to perfectly blend high-resolution rendering and frame rate targets with impressively rich visuals. This is the creation of Studio Liverpool, and it arrived in September 2008 after a long period of waiting. It was worth it. At its core, Wipeout HD offers tracks based on the 2 PSP games that they created for that system, but remade with much higher quality assets utilizing the full capabilities of the PlayStation 3. Plus, it has a fully redesigned single-player mode and loads of things to do within. We're actually looking at the complete version here, known as Wipeout HD Fury. This one was even released on a disc in some territories and includes additional tracks and modes. The big question here, though, is one of balance. Studio Liverpool aimed high with this one, utilizing many techniques that seemed out of reach for 1080p on a PS3. To achieve it, the developers have opted for a variable resolution strategy, rather than just targeting straight 1920 by 1080. As a result, the game can vary from a minimum of 1280 by 1080 up to a full native 1080p based on performance targets. This, I think, is a fair trade-off, which perfectly balances fidelity against performance, and it's something that would become increasingly common in the future, though in 2008, it was still relatively new. The tracks are all richly detailed with a sizable polygon budget, nice texture work, and pixel shader work alongside an impressive suite of special effects. Each ship can include as many as 30,000 triangles, and the lowest LOD for a ship is in the 10,000 polygon range, while tracks themselves can have millions of polygons as well. You really can see how much more detail was possible on this generation. What makes this possible though is that their 1080p 60 target was always the goal. The tracks were based on the PSP game, true, but new assets were built while keeping this 1080p 60 target in mind throughout development. They could continue to push up the level of detail up until the point that it became clear that the target would be exceeded. It was a nice iterative process. They also built a sophisticated shader system which is put to heavy use, especially in zone mode. Of course, the game does not utilize things such as cascaded shadow maps, which would have been far too costly, instead relying on baked shadows and lighting. In fact, I kind of feel like the push towards real-time shadows and lighting this generation is one of the reasons why so many games released struggled to run well. And I think Wipeout HD demonstrates beautiful results with its completely offline solution. Furthermore, the game makes heavy use of the SPUs. The developers offloaded things such as physics, particle simulation, data decompression, dynamic lighting, and more. Basically, the CPU is used to keep the heat off the RSX as much as possible. But alas, even with these beautiful visuals, there is still one caveat here. The performance is not 100% locked. The team opted for an adaptive VSync solution, which leads to screen tearing when performance dips below the target 60 FPS. In fact, if you look right along the top of the screen, you'll see a whole lot of tearing that was intended to be hidden by overscan. But unfortunately, you're probably going to notice it today. That said, it's not as bothersome as you might expect, but it is one blemish on an otherwise impressive package. It should be mentioned that you can run the game at 720p, and this nets you 2x MSAA as well, not to mention improved performance at the expense of pixel clarity. Ultimately, all these years after Wipeout HD, I've only come to appreciate more what was achieved at the time. This is an amazing accomplishment of engineering and artwork that stands strong today. While it's true that it has a few minor issues such as screen tearing, I still feel this one deserves the full 1080 out of 1080, just for its sheer ambition. Unfortunately, just a week later, we'd go from one of the best examples of 1080p gaming on the PS3 to one of the worst. This is Sacred 2, an action RPG released in early October on PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, and boy does it have issues. Rich covered this one back in the day, complete with a full tech interview, and the results were rather eye-opening. You see, the game delivers full HD 1080p across both PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and it even does this when outputting 720p, so it's effectively downsampling all the time. But where it gets weird is if you select 480p output. They determined that it wasn't worth spending all those pixels for 480p, and as a result, this reduces the rendering resolution down to 720p internally, improving performance in the process. Problem is, there's no way to actually utilize 720p rendering unless you're outputting 480p. Crazier still, if you use the 480p 4x3 option, it actually renders at 1280 by 960 internally. Wild. Some of the decisions made in building this game ultimately means that it runs terribly though. The target frame rate of 30 FPS is rarely reached. Instead, your experience with Sacred 2 will involve a near constant barrage of screen tearing combined with choppy movement. It has this hand-cranked feel that we often associate with the worst of this generation of games. So what's going on with this one? Well, it's clear that they're pushing techniques such as shadow maps and using an expensive pixel shaders setup, and I feel it's this combination of visual features that proves just a little too much for these systems at this target resolution. Given the mostly overhead nature of the game, there's a lot of lateral camera movement too, which makes it all the worse. Basically, this is an example of how not to do it. In some ways, it's worse than Full Auto 2 and Ultimate Alliance even, simply due to the prevalence of screen tearing throughout. Given the poor performance and the 2008 release date then, it should be a shoo-in for the lowest score on this list, but at the same time, there is some nice technology in play, so I'll be merciful and award this one 250p's out of 1080, a notch above Ultimate Alliance, which is arguably the uglier game. The next two things I want to mention are both widely considered 1080p titles, but, well, let's just see what's up. So first we have Luminous Supernova, a PS3 iteration of Lumines from the PSP. I never quite liked this one as much as the original PSP release, but I can't deny that it's still a phenomenal puzzle game at its core. So Luminous is basically a musical puzzle game. A bar moves across the screen to the beat of each song, while clearing any matched squares along the way. The key to success is building combos, but dropping them in time with the beat for maximum clear. The combination of wild visual designs and great music really elevates the experience, but unfortunately, the 1080p support is perhaps less impressive than I might have hoped. If you look closely, you'll see some extra crisp 1080p lines in specific areas of the screen, showcasing that it is indeed truly rendering at 1080p, but most of the actual artwork from which the game is built seems to have been designed for a lower resolution and has a softer appearance. It doesn't detract from the experience much, but it doesn't offer the pristine 1080p experience I had hoped for either. As a result, I have to give this one a lower score, coming in at 300 out of 1080, just due to the fact that it doesn't really deliver 1080p in most areas of the game. The score certainly doesn't reflect the quality of the game though. After this then, I also wanted to touch on something called Linger in Shadows. This is a unique release in that it's a demo scene project built by the group Plastic, possibly the first of its kind on a console released in an official capacity. It's a truly bizarre and beautiful experience with some truly stunning visuals. I'd always believed that this one was 1080p as well, and most other people on the internet seem to suggest this too, and it does indeed output 1080p, with certain aspects of the rendering seemingly taking full advantage of this, but there are also major sequences where the pixel resolution is much lower, coming in around 720p, so it does actually seem somewhat variable. Not necessarily a dynamic resolution scaling solution, but it does vary per scene, probably due to performance. But I can't deny that what they're showcasing in this demo is visually interesting and enjoyable to behold. It's certainly cool to see such a product on a console like this, and it even has a number of Easter eggs and interactive bits as well. These guys would go on to make something called Datura later in the life of PlayStation 3, but for now, it's a cool little demo that I'll give a cool 650p's out of 1080. It may not always deliver on the full HD promise, but it certainly is striking. With this, however, there's just two more things to address for 2008. Firstly, I did not mention it earlier, but I wanted to address this long-standing discussion around Disgaea 3. You know, the first PS3 entry in the popular strategy RPG series. For years, I've seen comments suggesting that this was a 1080p game with low-res pixel art characters. So we investigated and determined that while it does upscale to 1080p, and that's probably where the confusion comes from, the internal rendering resolution is actually just 720p. Too bad. Hopefully though, that clears things up. Our final game for 2008 though is not exactly what I describe as a banger. Or maybe it is, I don't know, you tell me. It's Brain Challenge from Gameloft, which arrived in late November on that PS Triple. This game was clearly inspired by the popularity of Brain Age for the Nintendo DS, which was released back in 2005. I only mention it here though because it does have this super clean 1080p interface along with full 3D characters displayed in full HD. There's really not much more to it, but I was kind of surprised that they would even bother targeting a higher resolution in a game like this, so I wanted to mention it here. So what do we want to give it? I don't know, it's not an amazing looking game by any means, but it does hit 1080p, so how about we split the difference and go with 510. Let's do it. With that, however, we've reached the end of 2008, and aside from Wipeout HD, I'd argue it wasn't a great year for 1080p games on the PlayStation 3. Pixel Junk Eden and Echo Chrome definitely help, but most of this year's heavy hitters were firmly in the 720p category, or less even. As a result, the 2008 Full HD grand total is just 670p's, our worst year yet. We still have a ways to go, however, at least up through 2013 or 2014 in the launch of PS4, but things start to get a little weird from here. 2009 and 10 are both extremely sparse when it comes to 1080p releases, before the release schedule picks up again big time in 2011. So what do they have in store for us? Let's find out.
Dear PlayStation, just got my PS3. So what you got?
What do I got? 2 words. Montage.
Two 2009 wasn't a great year for 1080p, but it was an important year nonetheless, as this is the year Sony finally started to turn things around with the PS3. They would unleash a redesigned system, the Slim, at a lower price point, while completely changing the branding with a new logo and new packaging for games. It's the year Naughty Dog would unleash the seminal Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, and Guerrilla Games would finally deliver Killzone 2, both of which offered a new level of visual fidelity for the system. This was also the year when Sony rolled out the very first commercial featuring Kevin Butler.
Dear PlayStation, MLB 09 The Show thinks I can't hit the high and inside fastball. You're gonna fix that, right?
Well, Dustin, PlayStation gamers demand the most realistic baseball game ever, so we're just going to keep it as is. It's called integrity.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just polishing my MVP trophy. How many MVPs do you know that can't hit that pitch?
Apart from you?
MLB 09 The Show, the most realistic baseball game ever. Rated E for everyone.
Say what you will about Kevin Butler, but this ad campaign was definitely a huge win for Sony. They moved away from the more abstract, which to be fair I did enjoy, to something that was a lot more immediate and attention grabbing. It worked. Of course, the game featured in this initial Kevin Butler ad is none other than MLB 09 The Show, and I'd argue this is the year when the series finally hit it big. This time, MLB brings a significant step up in visual quality over the last game. Remember, both games default to 720p, but 1080p is available by unchecking the lower resolutions from the system menu. This will probably be the last MLB game we discuss today though, as after this point, the 1080p modes become upscale rather than targeting actual 1080p native. For now though, MLB 09 includes all the post-processing effects from the 720p mode, unlike 08, and it looks pretty darn good while doing so. For this era, MLB 09 was actually one of the best looking sports games on the market, and one of the only ones to retain full HD 1080p support. Beyond this, the frame rate is boosted up to 60 FPS, though it doesn't necessarily retain this at all times, but it is a huge step up from MLB 08. If you want a stable 60 though, you're gonna need to use the 720p mode. Still, San Diego Studio continues to impress with this release, making them one of the developers that focus the most on hitting 1080p on the PS3, and thus I give this one the same 900p's as NBA 07 for bringing the quality back up. Visual quality is superior, even if performance is slightly below expectations. It's a very nice looking game in the end, so I think it deserves this score. But let me rewind for a moment actually. MLB 09 was the big spring game for PS3, but the actual first 1080p game we should talk about came out a little bit earlier, and that's the second game from that game company, and it's known as Flower. This is an interesting one then. It's far more visually ambitious, with large open fields filled with flowing blades of grass that react to the wind as you move through the world. It's deeply relaxing, but also rather melancholic, I would argue. A real treat to play. That said, it's clear that sacrifice was required to pull this off, and the resolution is walked back significantly from the prior game flow. Essentially, it renders at 1440 by 810. Which is still above 720p mind you, but not reaching the heights of full HD 1080p. Furthermore, it's limited to just 30 frames per second this time, though at least it's quite stable. So this is an interesting middle ground then, but the end result is generally pretty good. The game looks reasonably clean in motion, and the design is attractive even today. Thus, I give Flower 790 Ps out of 1080. In April then, another small-scale game arrived, known as Comet Crash. This one is a tower defense game, much like Pixel Junk Monsters, but I found it less enjoyable overall. The aesthetic is also somewhat clinical, I might say. But from a pure technical point of view, the developers have done a good job here, as the game does render at a native 1920 by 1080 with 4x MSAA. It's about as clean of an image as you could ever expect from the PlayStation 3, and for that reason alone, it actually looks pretty good in action. Ultimately, this one is very clean, but boring, at least from a visual perspective. But the sharpness of it and the quality of its MSAA at least earns it a solid 815 out of 1080, so not bad. Next up though is another unusual project, our first Unreal Engine game for the PS3 on this list. This is Fat Princess, a native 1080p Unreal Engine 3 game. Yep, I didn't think such a game even existed on the system, but the development team actually managed to deliver. So Fat Princess is mostly played from a tilted overhead perspective, and the art design leans heavily on cel shading, to great effect I might add. The game does feature impressively implemented shadows as well, which are cast on moving objects, and sometimes even utilizes things such as Unreal's depth of field. So while it's definitely constrained in terms of overall complexity, there is more going on with this game than I actually expected. Beyond that, the quality of the texture work and the simple yet clean model design delivers strong results. Surprisingly, it also runs at a fairly consistent 30 frames per second, and it's this combination of a stable frame rate and the clean rendering that really surprised me here, as the PlayStation 3 traditionally has a somewhat poor relationship with Unreal Engine 3, though by 2009 at least things were starting to improve. As a result of its strong art design and super crisp image quality, in addition to the impressive work in delivering full HD graphics with UE3, I have to give Fat Princess a full 960 out of 1080. Remember Military Madness on TurboGrafx 16? No? Well, in 2009, it received a new iteration, known as Military Madness Nectaris. A clever name again, which combines the US and Japanese titles. Hey, haven't we seen this before? Well, that's for good reason. Backbone worked on this project as well, and you know what? I like it a whole lot more. So this one is basically a hex-based strategy game, like the original on PC Engine, presented from an overhead perspective with battles featuring more dynamic animated sequences. The game targets native 1080p output once again, just like the prior two Backbone games we discussed earlier, and it seems to utilize 2x MSAA, resulting in remarkably crisp, clean lines throughout. This also applies to the user interface, which is very beautifully and sharply rendered. I think they've done a good job capturing the look and feel of the original game, but using 3D polygons instead. It works. That said, of course, the game is limited in scope as a result of its subject matter, but I think it works and runs surprisingly well. It's a strong example of where 1080p can be strategically deployed with strong results. Backbone did a really nice job with this one. As a result of its crisp 1080p image, with edge treatment no less, and its relatively stable frame rate, this return of Nectaris deserves at least 700 out of 1080, I think. Next up, we already looked at Comet Crash, but what about another type of crash? A gravity crash, if you will. Well, you're in luck, because Gravity Crash is the first original game created by Just Add Water, and it's pretty darn good. It's essentially a modern homage to the BBC micro game Thrust, but with beautiful vector graphics aesthetic and smooth performance. It offers two different control schemes, including a modern dual stick option, and features a soundtrack created by none other than Tim Wright, also known as Cold Storage, the man behind many of the great tracks featured in classic Wipeout games. With its simple, clean design, it's unsurprising that Just Add Water opted for 1080p output, targeting 60 frames per second. The extra resolution really helps sell that vector line art design of the visuals, and everything plays perfectly smoothly as a result. It's another example of a super polished classic arcade style experience that benefits from high resolution and high frame rate. As a result, this one deserves 1020 out of 1080. While we're talking 2D games, there's also Digger HD, a remake of an old PC game based on the Mr. Do concept. and it's as simple as it gets visually, but honestly it works pretty well. It all runs at a smooth 60 frames per second as you'd expect, and the transitions between stages are super smooth. It's definitely not pushing any kind of technical boundaries, of course, but I still thought it was worth mentioning as it highlights the kind of small-scale game one could make while taking advantage of 1080p. It's also kind of an example of the sort of minefield I'm dealing with here when it comes to 1080p support. There's no real indication that it's a 1080p game, and there's probably other games like this out there on PSN or even on disc. For this reason, it's very difficult to determine just how many actual 1080p titles are on the PS3. As for this one, however, I'll hand it a nice 690 out of 1080 then. Just a notch below Nectaris, but not too bad. 2009's last major 1080p title, however, is yet another installment in the Pixel Junk series, and this one is my favorite yet. It's Pixel Junk Shooter. So Shooter involves piloting a craft through a wide range of subterranean stages while rescuing trapped scientists within. The hook for this game involves fluid manipulation, where each section of a stage essentially becomes a puzzle. How do you get through without dying or losing scientists to flowing water, bubbling lava, or the bizarre ferrofluids? Routing these liquids is key, and this is the game's defining feature, the robust fluid simulation. Destroy a rocky barrier, for instance, and water realistically pours out into the caverns below. It's incredible looking. The developers basically built a 2D particle flow simulation that can run up to 32,768 particles at 60 frames per second, spread across 5 SPUs. There's a lot to it though, beyond the scope of this video anyways, but the result is pools of fluid that can flow, collide, and interact with the world in a remarkably realistic fashion. With its simple, clean art direction, they were able to achieve all of this at the aforementioned 60 FPS, while also targeting native 1080p. It's one of the smoothest and cleanest looking games we've examined today as a result. Everything here is just perfect. When you couple this with a rich, memorable soundtrack, you have an exceptionally well-made title here that holds up brilliantly even now. This is Q Games at its best. Due to its crisp 1080p presentation, smooth 60 frames per second update, and amazing fluid simulation, I'm awarding Shooter 1075 out of 1080. Good job, Q Games. With that, however, we've reached the end of 2009. A banner year for PlayStation 3 to be sure, but not a great one for 1080p games. There were a few others that I could have included though, such as LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga, but that one's technically only 960 by 1080, which is just a few more pixels than 720p. If we included every game like this, the list would be significantly longer. But despite the lower number of games in 2009, the Full HD score for this year is the second highest yet, coming in at 869. Nice. With the arrival of 2010, however, Sony has a lot more in store for PS3 fans, including the first next-generation sequel to God of War and the release of its Wii competitor, the PlayStation Move controllers, which would go on to become central to their VR solution many years later on PS4. So with that said, let's hop straight into the next decade. So 2010 is a weird one. There was a lot of stuff happening this year, but in the world of 1080p games, this is far and away the least packed year of the bunch. Sony did have a particularly strong E3 showing, I think, with this rather amusing presentation from Kevin Butler though.
Because every gamer is a true gamer. Motion gamers, sitting gamers, everyone. And though we may pledge fanboy allegiances to different flags, deep down inside we all serve one master, one king. And his name is gaming. Forever may he reign!
This was also the year that Sony would introduce support for stereoscopic 3D in games, a short-lived fad that gave us some cool results, I think. Even games like Wipeout 3D, Stardust HD, and Ridge Racer 7 would receive updates for stereoscopic 3D, with a lot more to come. For 1080p gamers though, there wasn't that much to choose from this year. That's not to say there aren't any. Take Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Yes, it's a 2D pixel art game, but I wanted to highlight it specifically for one reason. It takes advantage of 1080p to enhance its pixel upscaling. And this is key because games like Mega Man 9, which do offer 1080p output, still utilize blurring and filtering, resulting in a very soft image. Scott Pilgrim does not take this approach and instead presents razor-sharp artwork that looks absolutely fantastic. This is the way scaling should be done at 1080p. The quality of the animation and background work is also phenomenal and cannot be understated. That said, the game itself does let me down in some key areas, and replaying it kind of reminded me of this. It lacks proper grappling, the knockdowns and stage design are both way too long at times, and it doesn't quite match the finesse of truly classic brawlers. That said, for 2010, this was pretty excellent, and better than most on the market, plus it has an absolutely wonderful soundtrack. So just for the quality of its scaling and visual work, I wanted to give this one 750 Ps out of 1080. The score is really only held down by the fact that it's basically a low-res pixel art game, but hey, I think it counts. Next up though is yet another brawler, and this time it's a PS3 port of Castle Crashers, a once Xbox 360 arcade exclusive. This one also supports 1080p, but the results are perhaps less impressive. You see, it's clear that some of the art was designed for that lower res HD output, and as a result, you have this weird mix of razor-sharp 2D elements with slightly filtered elements within a single scene. So while it does benefit from 1080p, it doesn't exactly take full advantage of it. It also runs at just 30 frames per second, which honestly isn't acceptable for a 2D game like this. Castle Crashers was pretty popular back when it was new, but looking at it through a modern lens, I see now that it's actually a rather subpar brawler. The mechanics are very simple and it's extremely repetitive. That's not to say you can't have a good time in multiplayer mode, of course. As a result though, this one receives just 450 points. It looks clean and nice enough, but ultimately it doesn't impress nor take full advantage of 1080p. One that released earlier in the year though that I wanted to mention briefly is this, Zoldner X2 Final Prototype. This is a horizontal shooter with some interesting visual elements that kind of remind me of games like Polestar on the Neo Geo. Essentially, it uses a lot of pre-rendered graphics displayed at high frame rates, leading to a smooth, almost hypnotic look in motion. Now, the game boasts 1080p output, and technically it does produce 1080p, but it's also limited by the resolution of the core assets. It is pre-rendered after all. Now, it's reasonably sharp and clean in motion, I suppose, but clearly the art assets themselves were not created specifically to take advantage of this higher resolution. And this is the reason why I wanted to mention it here, because in my mind it was always a 1080p game, and looking at the documentation around it, it also seems like it was intended to be, but looking closer, I'm not so convinced. Thus, while the game does indeed look pretty nice, I have to give it a lower score due to its seemingly upscaled assets. It comes in at 450 points, just like Castle Crashers. Up next, released in October, this is Aqua Panic, which was originally released in 2008 for other platforms, but finally made its way to PlayStation 3 in 2010. It's another small-scale puzzle game, but this one is surprisingly fun. It's basically a combination of Lemmings with The Incredible Machine, where you use various tools to redirect the flow of water in an attempt to save all the fish. But I'm not a huge fan of the art direction, and the water simulation updates at just half rate, so it doesn't look especially great in motion. Even still, the artwork is all displayed at native 1080p, so it's very crisp, and the scrolling and cursor movement happens at 60 frames per second. As a result, I'll be generous and award this one 530 Ps out of 1080, because why not? Another October release then is Dead Space Ignition. But don't get too excited, Ignition is basically a pre-order bonus for Dead Space 2 and more of a visual novel combined with a puzzle game. It features a range of logic and twitch-based challenges to solve while telling its story using these motion comic sequences. It's entertaining enough, but certainly not inspiring. All of the puzzle stuff though is displayed at native 1080p, so it looks very crisp. It is, however, very simplistic in its visual design, so it's certainly not a showcase for 1080p output. The game itself is also very basic and really only serves as a pre-order bonus for Dead Space fans rather than working as a real standalone game, though I believe it was also available as that. As a result, I'll hand this one just 500 out of 1080. It gets the job done, but doesn't really go far beyond this. Another one I want to mention quickly then are the 2 special edition versions of Monkey Island. That's right, the first 2 games in the Monkey Island series received enhanced re-releases. The first actually arrived in 2009, but the one I want to talk about, the second game, arrived in 2010. I greatly prefer the second special edition in terms of overall visual style and features such as a commentary track, but both of them offer a wonderful retro mode that lets you seamlessly switch between the original pixel art and the remade visuals. And thankfully, you get a nice 1080p output, which works extremely well with the new artwork, but also allows the retro mode to scale up nicely to 1080p with super crisp pixels. The team definitely did a good job with this release. Beyond that, the music implementation was greatly improved from the first special edition, and they recorded all new voices, which sound awesome.
How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
A woodchuck could chuck no amount of wood since a woodchuck can't chuck wood.
But if a woodchuck could chuck and would chuck some amount of wood, what amount of wood would a woodchuck chuck?
Even if a woodchuck could chuck wood, and even if a woodchuck would chuck wood, should a woodchuck chuck wood?
Of course, going into the history of Monkey Island and these remakes is beyond the scope of this video, but I did want to at least briefly highlight the second game. Thus, I'll award this one a solid 750 out of 1080. So there's been a lot more games in 2010 thus far, that's for sure, but unfortunately the Full HD scores haven't been great. It started to feel like at this point developers were more interested in targeting advanced graphical features at lower resolutions than aiming for 1080p. Our next one though is what you get when you're perhaps a little overambitious. It begins with this ridiculously ostentatious introduction movie, which starts with a near 4-minute piano solo crafted by the world-famous pianist Linneman that delves into the creation of the materials used to build the cars. This is Kazunori Yamauchi at his most extravagant, I think. When you play Gran Turismo 5, you play by his rules. So, Gran Turismo 5, for better or for worse, is basically the largest game in the series as of this point, with an absurd number of events, features, cars, tracks, and modes. It is loaded with stuff to do. Problem is, it was also clear that this was perhaps too much for the team to fully realize. I mean, it took more than half a decade to build the game, and only a percentage of its overall car count are of the so-called premium variety. You know, premium cars feature higher polygon counts with fully modeled interiors designed from the ground up for PlayStation 3. The standard cars, however, available from the used car garage, are lifted from the PlayStation 2 era, with just minor touch-ups and some new wheels. The menu system then is bursting with selectable options presented at full 1080p, but it's kind of loaded to the point of overkill. There's almost too much here for its own good, and everything is divided up by loading screens in a way that makes navigation feel frustrating. Like GT Prologue, Gran Turismo 5 delivers the same 1280 by 1080 rendering resolution with MSAA for 3D elements, while everything else is rendered out at full 1080p. Image quality is actually rather reasonable when you consider the quality of the visuals on display, but there are certainly some caveats. Transparencies, for instance, are rendered at an obscenely low resolution to the point where you'll find yourself bumping up against pixels the size of your fist. Shadows are also very low resolution, and the whole thing just feels like it's a hair beyond the scope of what the PS3 can comfortably deliver. Plus, the initial install can literally take hours to complete, with 27 individual patch files to download, plus of course the actual data install itself. Of course, as of the making of this video, the game's online mode is completely unavailable, but thankfully, it still remains fully playable in single player mode. GT5 did support stereoscopic 3D, however, which comes with a significant hit to resolution, but it's surprisingly effective and impressive to see it included at all. Heck, they even allow for a pseudo head tracking with the PlayStation Eye camera, but alas, it's just the position rather than the direction, so it doesn't really work especially well. But still, the game is just packed with features at every corner, and perhaps that was one of its problems. Speaking of features, certain tracks now feature dynamic time of day and variable weather conditions such as rain. Rain has had an impact on handling as well, so it's not just cosmetic. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, premium cars feature those beautifully realized cockpits complete with functional windshield wipers and everything. Honestly, the whole project is an interesting, ambitious, yet messy package. You can feel that a lot of love was poured into its creation, but it also feels like the point where Polyphony Digital was stretched just a little too thin for its own good. Unfortunately, performance is also stretched too thin for its own good. Gran Turismo was known for delivering a smooth 60 frames per second, at least during the PlayStation 2 era, but the move to PS3, with all these crazy features and high-resolution rendering, is too much. GT5 features some of the most egregious tearing in a big AAA release, and many of its more demanding races struggle to deliver anything resembling a stable 60 FPS. It's really all over the place, just a big choppy mess sometimes, especially in the rain. Still, I can't deny that this is an ambitious and beautiful looking game in many ways, and that alone makes it an interesting game to revisit, even if it is flawed. With its lower resolution target and sheer volume of screen tearing, GT5 scores below the prior two GT entries mentioned today, coming in at 740p's out of 1080. This won't be the last time we see Gran Turismo in this video though. And that's 2010 in a nutshell. A lean year for 1080p to be sure, but I have some thoughts on this. Essentially in 2010, the new wave of HD remasters, which are ripe for 1080p support by the way, had yet to really kick off, with just a small number of releases here and there. Furthermore, 2D games would begin to see a proper resurgence after this point, and these also make a perfect candidate for 1080p. Alas, with its low scores and low number of games, 2010 comes in at just 595 for the entire year. With this in mind though, let's jump to the next year of PlayStation 3, 2011.
Flying over the middle of the Rubal-Khali Desert, looking for some lost city in the sand. Next thing I know, plane's going down. I'm hanging like a rag doll at 30,000 feet, just trying to hold on.
And a plague on every corner. When half the city hated me, and the other half wanted me dead. He brought out my good side.
I'm telling you, war has changed. So you do what you have to. I'm no hero. But whatever good I've done, it was him.
It was in the days of suffering when the gods made their might known. When no mortal dared stand up to Zeus. He did.
Omaha. Pinned down on that godforsaken beach. Thinking if I lay there, I'll maybe die. But if I get up, there ain't no maybe about it. Then one man broke through. Michael.
Michael.
When the Templars murdered my family. When the whole bloody world's gone crazy. Hellcat, Sector 9, to Michael! Michael! For all he does. For all of us. To Michael. To Michael!
Ah yes, 2011, the start of a new decade, and a new chance for the PlayStation 3 to shine. By now, the PS3 was selling well. The system was more affordable. It had PlayStation Move support and stereoscopic 3D. It seemed like a decent machine, and the campaign with "It Only Does Everything" actually did make some sense. Unfortunately, this was also the year of the PSN hack, where it was down for weeks. An unprecedented event for the industry. There was a decent number of 1080p games released this year too, but most of them didn't even arrive until the second half of the year. This is also the year when the sheer volume of releases actually makes it difficult to track what's really 1080p and what's not. So I'm certain that there are some titles that I may have overlooked for this video, but hey, These are some of the more notable releases at least. The first big 1080p title then is a fantastic little game from Drinkbox known as Tales from Space About a Blob. It's a completely 2D side-scrolling game that kind of reminds me of Loco Roco again, but with a western twist, and it's full HD 1080p at 60 frames per second. That's why it's on this list, of course. This is the very first game from Drinkbox, and it's delightful. The themes and visual design didn't initially captivate me, but after spending time with it, I walked away impressed. You basically control an alien blob that was stranded on Earth and captured by an evil scientist. You'll roll your way through various stages, increasing your size, Katamari style, while tackling puzzles and obstacles along the way. More importantly, it's displayed at a full native 1080p, allowing its artwork to truly shine. And it even runs at a rock-solid 60 frames per second. So while it's relatively constrained in what it attempts to deliver, it's a nice-looking game and a great introduction to the world of Drinkbox. We'll be seeing them again later in this video. As a result though, About a Blob deserves a solid 800 out of 1080 for its clean visual design and smooth frame rate, making it a great way to start 2011 on the PlayStation 3. In June then, we finally arrive at Under Siege. No, not that one. I'm talking about this, a real-time strategy game created for the PlayStation 3. A game which kinda reminds me of Myth: The Fallen Lords in that you command small armies around various maps from an overhead 3D perspective while tackling objectives along the way. It's more focused on strategy than things like resource gathering, and at least as far as I've played, it has some nice story sequences as well. This PS3 exclusive is built using the Fire engine and uses deferred rendering. It was also created by a small Portuguese studio known as Seed. It features a full campaign, plus multiplayer and map creation options. A pretty robust package, if I do say so myself. Amazingly, the team managed to deliver this one at full HD 1080p with FXAA no less, which was still relatively new for this era. MLAA became far more common on PlayStation 3, so this is interesting. It also features full shadow maps and a rather aggressive but nice looking fog of war effect. Now, it doesn't perfectly nail its performance target, which is 30 frames per second, as it does exhibit mild screen tearing, but honestly, it's not too bad. It's certainly better than something like Sacred 2, and the extra resolution is certainly welcome in an RTS game with a zoomed out camera. It's a small scale game then, but interesting and clearly very well made. As a result, I'll hand this one a solid 700 out of 1080p's. It takes full advantage of 1080p, but struggles a little bit with performance. Next up, how about some familiar territory? This is MotorStorm Apocalypse. I just produced a full episode on this series, but I wanted to briefly mention Apocalypse once again, as technically it is a 1080p game, well, at least as much as Gran Turismo 5 is. So firstly, if you missed that episode, Apocalypse is the third mainline entry in the MotorStorm series, taking place on an island that is, well, falling apart. The big hook here is that major track-changing events can occur mid-race, forcing you to readjust your route to compensate, and it's really cool. For this one, the developers managed to up the resolution from 1280 by 720 to 1280 by 1080 with dynamic resolution scaling, meaning it can actually dip below this point as well. That means we're looking at a resolution similar to Gran Turismo 5, but with DRS and MLAA instead of MSAA. And it works pretty well, I'd argue, but it's definitely not among the sharpest games on this list. It also happens to support stereoscopic 3D, which is a really nice feature, of course. Naturally, given what's happening on screen, this game runs at just 30 frames per second, but honestly, it's adequate for a game like this, especially considering the hardware itself. It's not flawless or anything, but it does a good job maintaining a stable 30. Now, if you want to know more about MotorStorm Apocalypse, I do recommend you check out the full DF Retro episode on that series, but for this episode, I'm going to give this one 750 out of 1080. The next title I'd like to talk about in 2011, though, is an HD remaster of a classic series. That's Splinter Cell. Yep, the first 3 Splinter Cell games received the HD remaster treatment exclusively on PlayStation 3, and each game offers a native 1080p mode. The Splinter Cell series was known for pushing technological boundaries back on the original Xbox, and Chaos Theory is widely considered the best of the bunch. The series follows the exploits of Sam Fisher as he infiltrates various locations while dispatching foes along the way. The primary technical feature here centers on the use of light and shadow, with many light sources casting real-time shadows to great effect. This package was released right around the time of the rise of HD remasters, and each game is derived from the respective PC versions of the originals. While it does support 1080p output, this option is actually hidden. I say hidden because by default, all three games output at 720p instead, but if you disable 720p as an option at the OS level, the game then will boot in full native 1080p mode. So why would they hide something like this, you ask? Well, it's pretty simple. Performance. The trilogy does not run well on PlayStation 3 in full HD mode. The entire experience is dragged down by a laughably sluggish frame rate. Chaos Theory is far and away the worst of the bunch, with the frame rate mostly falling below 20 frames per second. It feels awful. The original game fares better and is generally playable at 1080p, but it can still dip pretty hard as well. It's a case where you almost wonder if this option was intended to be the original default setting, but they were unable to lock down the performance and settled for 720p instead. As a result, this is a case where I recommend sticking with 720p, as at least in that case the frame rate is reasonably stable and the game still managed to look great. Honestly, replaying Splinter Cell is an interesting proposition. I loved these games back in the day. They're very rigid, with a focus on trial and error gameplay though, and that can be difficult to return to from a modern perspective. There's also a distinct lack of polish in how events play out, like in Pandora Tomorrow. When you take out this guy's captor, you actually see him pop out of the chair briefly before returning to the chair. That shouldn't have happened, I think. Of the three, again, Chaos Theory I think holds up the best. Still, this collection is an interesting release and not terrible provided you play in the 720p mode. As a result of its poor 1080p performance, however, I cannot award this one more than 350p's out of 1080. It's honestly a terrible mode that should not have shipped in the game in the first place. Thankfully, our next game fares a lot better. It's the God of War Origins collection from Ready at Dawn. This one is derived from the two PSP God of War titles that were also created by Ready at Dawn. The idea? Remaster them into full HD 1080p with plenty of visual upgrades and all the extras you could ask for. While neither game quite reaches the heights of the original PS2 titles, I was always impressed with how well they managed to nail the feeling of God of War in portable form. They are certainly good enough, and even on a console, the games managed to hold up shockingly well. And both titles also deliver full 1080p at 60 frames per second, a dramatic upgrade from the originals on PSP. Performance is fluid, and they even offer support for stereoscopic 3D, since that was kind of a thing during this era. That said, there can be some tearing during certain sequences, specifically in the second game, but overall it's pretty smooth. Beyond this, however, I also love the fact that they went back and redid all of the pre-rendered video clips at a much higher quality than they were on PSP, and they even remade the entire interface for 1080p. Ready at Dawn did a phenomenal job with this collection then, and it would be their last big project prior to shifting development over to The Order 1886 for PlayStation 4, which hadn't yet been announced in 2011. Ultimately, this is a great example of how to do an HD remaster and is not the last of its kind that will be seen in this episode. Thanks to their superlative work on this package then, I award the Origins Collection 1020 out of 1080. This is how you do an HD re-release. Just 1 week later, however, a very different game would arrive on digital storefronts. It's Burnout Crash from Criterion Games. And this title serves as the connective tissue between Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, released in 2010, and the upcoming Most Wanted, released in 2012. But it focuses entirely on the crash aspect that was made popular in the Burnout games. This time, the game is viewed from a top-down perspective as you crash and explode your car through various junctions. The name of the game is Aftertouch, controlling your wreckage to score points, and honestly, it's a lot of fun. In building this new game, however, Criterion opted for full 1080p output, but at 30 frames per second, rather than 60 like the actual Burnout games that came before it, though they sometimes did drop the frame rate in crash mode. Furthermore, the game's visual style has been dramatically altered for this game, with more of a cartoony vibe. As a result, it's rather unlike most of Criterion's other works, but definitely worth checking out nonetheless, and it does deliver on the promise of Full HD, something that was off the table for their racing games that generation. Thus, Burnout Crash comes in at 850p's out of 1080. If it were 60 FPS, it would definitely be angling for a top spot, but as it is, it's still a solid effort that's firmly in the realm of 1080p. But then just 1 week later, we're treated to our third HD remaster for 2011 with Eco and Shadow of the Colossus from Bluepoint Games, and honestly, this is their best one yet. These games remain beloved to this day after making a huge splash on PlayStation 2, at least for me, and this HD remastering is top tier work. As the title suggests, it includes both Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. Eco is a tremendous puzzle adventure game reminiscent of classics such as Another World or Flashback, with its own unique vibe. The atmosphere and mystery of Eco was mesmerizing at the time, and it was great to revisit it here in Full HD 1080p with MLAA no less. Shadow of the Colossus, on the other hand, was one of the most technically ambitious games created for PlayStation 2, but as a result of this, the frame rate was obscenely low. In bringing it to the PS3, however, even Bluepoint was not able to offer this game at full native 1080p, instead opting for 960 by 1080, meaning it doesn't really fit in with most of the other games in this list. That said, it does offer some nice visual improvements, including enhanced motion blur and stable performance. What really impresses me about this collection, though, is Bluepoint's adherence to recreating the original source material. So many of these HD collections were often lacking in terms of replicating certain visual effects. The games would be high res, sure, but they'd be lacking in the more subtle areas. Not so with this one. Everything from the way bloom lighting works to the accumulation blur that gives it that dreamlike appearance is fully intact, and the improvements to the assets are done in a very tasteful fashion. It feels exactly like the original game, even though it's technically enhanced, and that is key. This of course means the frame rate is also capped at 30 frames per second. If I recall, Ueda himself even noted that Eco was specifically designed to use the low resolution mode on PlayStation 2 with a target of 30 FPS in order to present a softer, more ethereal image. If you look at early footage of Eco, that was even running at 60 FPS, but it changed by release. Thus, I can't really criticize Bluepoint for sticking with this target. On top of all this, they even include stereoscopic 3D support, and it's one of my favorite examples from this era. Given all that then, I'd like to award this collection a solid 950 out of 1080. If both games had been Full HD native, it would have been an easy 1080 out of 1080, but as it is, it's still an amazing release. 1 month later, however, we received yet another HD remaster, but this one is a little different. It's a rebirth of the classic Model 2 arcade game, Daytona USA. Yep, the AM2 Classic returns on PlayStation 3, offering a full 60 frames per second, just like the original, but at native 1080p. It was the release I had wanted for so long, as we'd never received anything close to an arcade-perfect conversion. This one not only delivers the arcade game, it even does so with various enhancements. So as the quintessential early 90s arcade racer then, Daytona USA on PlayStation 3 includes the full arcade experience in addition to an objective-based mode to expand your time with the game. The development team managed to perfectly translate the arcade experience to a home console in this case, and it feels highly authentic. Playing this at full HD 1080p is certainly a treat, but that doesn't mean it's 100% flawless. You see, the team opted to implement MIP maps into the new renderer, a common thing, but it results in a visible dividing line between different MIP levels, and anisotropic filtering is not utilized to fix this. What's weird about that though, you ask? It is normal, right? Well, the original Model 2 and Model 3 arcade games never used mipmaps, and while this results in slightly noisier distant textures, it also increases the perceived sense of detail. In fact, AM2 rarely employed mipmaps at all in their games, even on Dreamcast, and thus it would have been great to retain that here. Despite this minor quibble, however, the rest of the package is simply superb, and it's effectively the definitive home console conversion of Daytona USA. As a result, this one earns 1070 out of 1080, losing just 10 points for the decision to use mipmaps. Next up then, the Pixel Junk series returns. Okay, so technically Pixel Junk Shooter 2 would have released earlier in 2011, but this video is already going so long, and basically this just expands upon the first game, so let's talk about the next one released later in the year, Pixel Junk Side Scroller. It's Q Games' take on the side-scrolling shooter formula, and it's a ton of fun, unsurprisingly. Aside from Pixel Junk Eden, this is perhaps the series' most abstract game. It's presented within a simulated CRT window, featuring curvature along the edges of the frame and simulated scan lines. Heck, if you look closely, you'll even spot the Pixel Junk logo burned into the bottom of the virtual CRT. A nice touch. The visual design itself is designed to mimic vector-based arcade games of the 80s, and even simulates the phosphor trail behind moving objects to great effect. It has this radiant quality that elevates the experience, and it's definitely a game that would benefit from a modern HDR display. Vector monitors, however, present imagery with a pristine quality that cannot be fully replicated on modern displays, or even in normal CRT for that matter. But by utilizing the full resolution of 1080p complete with edge treatment via anti-aliasing, it does manage to feel moderately faithful to this aesthetic. It's exceedingly sharp and clean to the eye, which is typical of Pixel Junk games in general, I suppose. The game wraps all of this up in a superb soundscape with music once again crafted by High Frequency Bandwidth, who is also responsible for the audio in Pixel Junk Shooter. The final stage in particular is just aurally superb. Naturally, all of this updates at 60 frames per second. It's the target frame rate, and the game never misses an update. It's basically flawless. Given all this then, I feel that Side Scroller deserves a solid 1070 out of 1080 as well, just a hair short of the top spot, but very impressive nonetheless. But 2011 isn't stopping yet. On November 15th, Ubisoft would release one of its best games of the era. It's difficult to put into words how meaningful the release of Origins was for me personally. The original Rayman is a longtime favorite of mine, and while I adore Rayman 2, I felt like the series lost its way after that point, due in part to the shift to the third dimension. Origins was the perfect opportunity for a proper two-dimensional rebirth, and series creator Michel Ancel even took the reins on this project. Ubisoft is well known for its in-house technology, and Origins has something special to offer from this perspective as well, as it's the introductory title built using the UbiArt framework, a new set of tools and technologies designed to push 2D vector art graphics at high frame rates across a wide range of platforms, while minimizing the need for programmer support wherever possible. It was a success, and in fact the engine is still used to this day in the Just Dance series. Rayman Origins takes full advantage of this technology, featuring beautifully drawn artwork with a near limitless number of parallax background layers, all scrolling smoothly across each stage. I was skeptical of high-resolution 2D art for platform games at this point, but Rayman Origins demonstrated what was possible with the right team. As a game, Origins is decidedly different from the very first Rayman, focusing more on momentum and speed, but it's packed with cute references that will tickle the fancy of longtime fans. Once you get into its style of gameplay, it really becomes addicting. All of this is presented at Full HD 1080p then, and the artwork itself is beautifully interpolated as well. It's as clean a game as you could ask for during this era. There's simply nothing between you and the game's artwork. More importantly, everything moves at a steady 60 frames per second even as the screen becomes flooded with projectiles and foes alike. It's just so buttery smooth and wonderful to play. What a phenomenal creation, a true masterpiece of its era. And that's not even getting into things like the soundtrack, which is equally superb. As a result then, I can think of no other score than a full 1080 out of 1080p's for Rayman Origins. It is 2D perfected and a wonderful showcase title for any system it would arrive on. Our last game of 2011 then is, you guessed it, another HD remaster, but this time with a twist. This is Tekken Hybrid, a disc which includes a demo of Tekken Tag 2, an entire Tekken movie, and an HD remaster of Tekken Tag Tournament based on the PlayStation 2 version, and that's what we're discussing today. The existence of this disc is what makes this unique. So Tekken Tag was one of the premier launch titles for PlayStation 2 in the West, building on the success of Soul Calibur for Dreamcast by fully rebuilding the arcade game with entirely new visuals targeting the more powerful PlayStation 2. It was a huge success and remains a gorgeous title to this day. The PlayStation 3 version of Tekken Tag Tournament is interesting then. It recreates the PS2 original faithfully, but does so at, expectedly, a higher resolution. It is not, however, Full HD 1080p. Rather, it seems to be 1536 by 1080. Why 1536, you ask? Well, divide that by 3 and you get 512, which is a common horizontal resolution for PlayStation 2 games, so perhaps there's a connection there. Either way, despite the lower resolution, it still looks very crisp and arguably better than Tekken Dark Resurrection. Remember, Tekken Tag utilizes character models with a higher polygon count than Tekken 5, as that fifth game would focus on more complex arenas which ate into the polygon budget. As you'd expect, however, everything moves at 60 frames per second without even a hint of slowdown. It's perfect, but again, you'd expect nothing less, right? With that said, I feel that Tekken Tag HD deserves 850p's out of 1080, falling slightly below the earlier Dark Resurrection given its time frame, but still offering a solid upgrade all around. With that, however, the year comes to a close. And the grand total for this year is 863. It would have been a lot higher, I think, if Splinter Cell hadn't released this year. So it's fair to say that 2011 was a very good year for PlayStation 3 then. Plenty of original games released alongside some killer HD remasters and even some unexpected rebirths. We didn't know it at the time though, but by the end of 2011, we were less than 2 years away from the release of the next PlayStation console with PlayStation 4. So what did 2012 hold for us? Let's find out. 2012, the year the world would end, supposedly. Yeah, it didn't happen, but what did happen was the arrival of new systems. PlayStation Vita launched in the West for one, and Nintendo would unleash the Wii U. Unfortunately, Vita only meant life to everyone but Sony, and it didn't fare quite as well as I might have hoped, and the same could also be said of the Wii U. Sony also announced and released the PS3 Super Slim, which is extra small compared to the original unit, but wasn't beloved due to the change in loading mechanism. So in that sense, it was a good year for new machines, even if they didn't fully succeed, but on PlayStation 3, it was a little less exciting, given that we were fast approaching the end of the generation, even if we didn't fully know it yet. That doesn't mean there weren't some good titles though, so let's get into those. Our first big 2012 release for PlayStation 3 is The Pinball Arcade from developer Farsight Studios. This one is designed to simulate real pinball tables licensed from other manufacturers. It would go on to feature various seasons, each with a large collection of available tables. Now, the history of digital pinball games is an interesting subject unto itself, and it's something I'd love to cover in the future. But this particular game is just one part of it, and it's a game that focuses on simulating real pinball. And of course, in the realistic pinball space, the other main competitor is Zen Pinball. But Zen Pinball didn't make this list since, based on my testing at least, the PlayStation 3 versions are limited to 720p. That's what separates the two. The Pinball Arcade delivers a full native 1080p experience instead, and it's glorious. This is a case where resolution does matter. Specifically, as a result of the camera work in these games, Digital Pinball benefits from as many pixels as possible in order to accurately recreate the finer details of these real-life tables. By targeting 1080p, the Pinball Arcade really stands out in terms of overall clarity against the competition. Furthermore, the game targets 60 frames per second, which honestly is a must for any digital pinball experience, and it nails this one with ease. Now, of course, this game would go on to receive a conversion for the yet unannounced PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, but PS3 already offered a great experience in 2012, and it still holds up brilliantly. But our next game is another small-scale indie title known as Dyad. It borrows a page from the book of Jeff Minter, delivering a hybrid of racing and shooting down a high-speed tunnel. You basically grapple from one enemy to the next, chaining together your actions as you move down said tunnel, while jamming out to some great music created by David Kanaga. Of course, with this sort of aesthetic, more resolution helps tremendously. Like several other games I've discussed over the course of this video, Dyad targets native 1080p for its output. The sharp lines and vibrant colors all work in tandem to deliver something that looks simply outstanding in motion. It of course delivers 60 frames per second as well, as you'd expect from a game like this. It's definitely an attractive looking game. Next then, we have Double Dragon Neon from WayForward, a modern take on Double Dragon that has a lot of heart. You know WayForward, of course, the creators of the Shantae series. Well, up until this point, they hadn't released many games on PlayStation 3, just an HD version of A Boy and His Blob and Blood Rain Betrayal. While Blob does support 1080p upscaling, the actual artwork is much lower resolution, while Blood Rain is just a 720p game. Double Dragon Neon, however, makes the jump to Full HD 1080p and offers some significant visual changes over these prior two games. The backgrounds are still sharp, beautifully drawn 2D, but the characters are now created from 3D polygons. They're stylized, of course, to match the backgrounds, but they're 3D. The visual design works pretty well, I think, but the animation is a little too fluid for its own good and feels out of place. I think it would have been better served by a keyframe approach similar to the Guilty Gear Xrd games. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a stunning game, but I do appreciate the aesthetic and it does hold up surprisingly well. It also plays better than most other games in the Double Dragon series. Sorry, it's true. And it features a tremendously catchy soundtrack from Jake Kaufman. Just listen to this. So yeah, it's full 1080p, and like many other games today, also full 60 frames per second. But you may have noticed that I didn't hand out a full HD score for the last two games, and the reason is simple. Double Dragon Neon, Dyad, and the Pinball Arcade all earn a cool 930p's out of 1080, and it also highlights something that's become somewhat of a trend in this video. If you haven't noticed, many of the games outputting 1080p also manage to do this at 60 frames per second. I point this out as it's another example of what you get when you balance visual quality and performance. It's about hitting those targets set early in the project and aiming for it throughout development. 1080p 60 absolutely is realistic on PS3, as we've seen many times now. While we're talking about 60 FPS, I also want to briefly mention a game called Rainbow Moon. a strategy RPG developed by SideQuest Studios, the same team behind the Zoldner X games. Unlike Zoldner X, however, this one comes a lot closer to realizing the 1080p dream at 60 FPS, with artwork that appears slightly sharper. It's played from an isometric point of view and features strategy RPG-like battle sequences. Now, I admit I haven't spent that much time with this one, but it does seem like a solid little game. The key here is that it offers both 1080p output and 60 FPS this time, serving again as an example of a small studio producing solid results on the PS3 at this resolution. In that sense, I will give this one a score of 500 versus the 450 of Zoldner X2, as it does take better advantage of the resolution, but if you look closely, it's still a little soft compared to many of the sharper titles on this list today. But hey, at least it's 60 FPS. Of course, our next game doesn't quite go for 60 FPS, but it's still quite lovely. It's Okami HD, the classic game from Clover reborn on PlayStation 3. Okami is a fantastic and unbelievably lengthy action RPG created by Clover, with a gorgeous, cel-shaded art style. It was originally developed for PlayStation 2, but arrived on the Wii in due time in somewhat compromised form, but the HD version is a dramatic improvement over both. It was created by Hexadrive and really delivers where it counts. But this case is unique, as it was long rumored that the game rendered internally at 2160p or native 4K due to a misunderstanding of a presentation written by the developer. While it does suggest that the internal resolution is actually 4K, in reality I'm not sure that's the case. Instead, it appears to use 4x MSAA at 1920 by 1080. I think it's the description of MSAA that's throwing everyone off. It just so happens that it's a perfect fit for a game like this, and similar to Echochrome, it winds up looking almost super sampled at a glance. Like the original, however, Okami HD is limited to just 30 frames per second, which is initially disappointing, but ultimately not a huge deal in the end given the nature of the game. The image quality is more important than the frame rate in this unique case. The big complaint I have about this HD re-release though is that there's no option for skipping cutscenes, and many of these scenes drag on far too long. The introduction alone is nearly half an hour. Although, considering the length of this video, I really shouldn't be one to talk, I suppose. Given the quality of its conversion then, I feel this one deserves 980p's out of 1080. It's close to perfection, but a few extra features could have really pushed it over the top.
PlayStation 3.
The last games I'd like to touch on for 2012 then are a trio of Sega arcade conversions: the groundbreaking Virtua Fighter 2, the fast-paced Fighting Vipers, and the stylish Sonic the Fighters. Each of these games were crafted around the Sega Model 2 arcade board, delivering cutting-edge visuals back in the 90s. I still remember experiencing Virtua Fighter 2 for the very first time at a local arcade. I had already been floored by the likes of Daytona USA by this point, but Virtua Fighter 2 seemed like something that shouldn't even exist. The arcade board could effortlessly draw these richly detailed 3D characters during an era when stuff like Star Fox and Super NES was still relatively new. There was nothing like this on home consoles or PCs alike. Even features such as texture filtering simply hadn't been seen in real-time games prior to Model 2. Fighting Vipers and Sonic then really pushed things further with more detailed arenas full of animation and even some clever shadow casting tricks. Gaze in awe as the shadow of the arena shifts around in real time as the semi-truck in the distance drives past. Or check out the squash and stretch animation in Sonic the Fighters. It was really unique and cool looking for the time. And these PS3 conversions are nearly as well made as Daytona USA from the prior year. The only caveat here is that unlike Daytona, these games are presented in their original 4:3 aspect ratio, but the actual rendering resolution is indeed Full HD 1080p. It's razor sharp. That doesn't mean there aren't some neat tricks possible here. There are 3 screen sizes available, and if you choose the full option, it stretches the image to fill a widescreen display, which isn't optimal, right? but if you change the aspect ratio on your TV to 4:3, you'll actually benefit from mild super sampling, as you're anamorphically squeezing the image back to the correct 4:3 aspect ratio. This of course also eliminates the blue bars that were present under the normal circumstances. Now all three games run at 60 frames per second without hiccups in performance, and this is key because the original arcade board actually outputs 57 Hz or thereabouts. Of course, the real-time introduction sequence in VF2 does seem to update at this lower rate, it should be noted, likely trying to maintain timing, but the actual gameplay is full 60 frames per second. Honestly, I only wish Sega had continued this trend of porting Model 2 games to home consoles, or even jumping over to Model 3. The quality of this work is simply outstanding. Also worth mentioning that Cyber Troopers Virtual On received the same treatment in 2013 exclusively on the Japanese PSN. It's exactly like these other games, which is to say really good. With the quality of these conversions in mind then, I want to hand all three of these games 1050 out of 1080p's. Just below Daytona due to the lack of native widescreen support and special objective modes, but they're still fantastic. And they're cheap, go buy them before they're gone. But with that, we've tackled the key games I wanted to cover for 2012. While lean on number of games, each 1080p release in 2012 was extremely well done, and thus the result comes in at a whopping 928p's. Ultimately, 2012 offered some decent software for PlayStation 3 users, but the system was beginning to feel dated at this point. So what could 2013 possibly hold for PS3 owners? '" 2013 started just like any other year, but it is also the year of PlayStation 4. On February 20th, Sony unveiled the new console to the public for the first time. It was decidedly a different beast from the now aging PlayStation 3 though, more focused perhaps, and it would become a huge success, more so than PS3. But the PS3 was certainly far from finished. Yeah, games like The Last of Us were huge, but not a 1080p experience. Of course, for fans of Chad Warden, he actually reappeared in this image the day after the reveal of PlayStation 4. I wonder what he thinks of the PS quadruple, or heck, the PS quintuple even. So if you were playing on a PlayStation 3 and searching for 1080p content, what did 2013 have to offer? Well, first up, Hatsune Miku arrives on PlayStation 3 in Project Diva F. While clearly derived from the Vita version of the game, this is actually a proper PS3 release this time, and it takes full advantage of the system. Well, mostly. Now, if you're not familiar with Hatsune Miku, it's a popular series of music games from Sega, using Vocaloid characters for the lyrics. This virtual diva concept made serious waves when it first arrived, and remains popular to this day. In bringing the game to PlayStation 3, the developers increased the rendering resolution to allow for full HD 1080p output, updating at, unfortunately, just 30 frames per second. The result is certainly good enough, but not necessarily amazing. Moreover, the game's UI is clearly upscaled from a lower resolution, which is likely given its Vita origins, and that lower frame rate is kind of unexpected. Still, the 3D models are beautifully anti-aliased, so it does look very clean and sharp during gameplay. A sequel would arrive in 2014 as well, but unfortunately I don't have a copy of that one, so it's not in this video. Just know that it does exist, and is apparently also 1080p. Yeah, if it isn't clear by now, outside of the games that Richard helped with, I purchased or already owned every single game in this video already, part of the reason why this has been such an undertaking. So how does Hatsune Miku stack up then? Well, given the lower frame rate and the scaled up 2D assets, I can only give this one 600p's out of 1080. It looks good, but it could be better. Something the next game would at least offer, apparently. But then we have something truly near and dear to my heart. This is Zone of the Enders 2, as included in the Zone of the Enders HD collection, but not as it was originally released. You see, the original version was developed by High Voltage Software and released in 2012. Problem is, that original version was terrible in terms of quality. 720p resolution, horrible performance, missing effects, bad texture work, so many problems. That's why it didn't show up in the prior year. But it was so bad that Konami actually commissioned a second developer, Hexadrive, to essentially remake the game again. And boy did they do a great job. But its release is also somewhat special to me personally, as it was the second ever game I covered for Digital Foundry back in 2013. So yeah, we have some history. Now what Hexadrive managed to deliver here is nothing short of a miracle then. They basically rebalanced the game across the PS3's SPUs, solved all of the various rendering issues, and massively improved performance. Things like color banding in the textures and the ultra low-res alpha effects were restored to their former glory, and in the interest of this video, the resolution was boosted to 1280 by 1080 for 3D objects with FXAA, but full 1080p for wireframe graphics, complete with 32x MSAA. Now, performance of course was greatly enhanced, with the game holding 60 FPS far more often compared to the often sub 30 FPS of the high voltage version. To date, this version of Zone of the Enders 2 remains the only remaster of a remaster that I can recall. And in fact, it's a really unprecedented situation. Now, this was the definitive version of the game for years until it was re-released on PlayStation 4 in even higher quality, but still, the PS3 version with this patch installed remains very impressive. Unfortunately, Zone of the Enders 1 did not receive this upgrade and remains somewhat flawed and missing effects. And of course, the awkward sounding localization is still in full effect here. I mean, who talks like this?
Since I found Jay with you, you'll have to give it to me.
What does Bara want with Callisto?
Oh? You don't look like a mining man to me.
Get lost!
Still, as a result, I have to award Zone of the Enders 2 HD specifically a full 900 out of 1080. Why so high for a 1280 by 1080 game? Well, frankly, the image treatment, the huge task of managing all those particles and effects, and the super clean wireframe rendering all push that score way up. This is a superb remastering effort, and honestly, it's a shame Konami didn't contract Hexadrive out for the entire project. The next game then is a release from Square Enix. It's Kingdom Hearts HD 1.5 Remix. This includes a remix of Kingdom Hearts from PlayStation 2, as well as RE Chains of Memories or whatever, plus some extra bonus features on top of that. So let's begin with Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, the remaster of Kingdom Hearts 1. The visuals remain largely comparable to the PlayStation 2 original, but the UI has been upgraded and is mostly presented at a much higher resolution, and other things have been enhanced where appropriate. It is ultimately just an HD remaster of course, but the result is surprisingly good. The game is still 30 frames per second like the original, but the boost in resolution and improved asset quality go a long way. Plus the visual design is rather timeless I think. The quality of the character models and animation work is really well done. Unlike many of the games on this list, Kingdom Hearts utilizes dynamic resolution scaling, reaching native 1080p when possible, but also dipping down to just above 900p. It does not utilize any form of anti-aliasing however, so you get those raw pixels, but given the nature of the visuals, it actually works rather well. Amusingly, if you choose 480i or 480p, you get 4x3 support just like PS2, which is something that no other version of these games offers. But if you choose HD resolutions, it of course plays in widescreen like this. Now, Chain of Memories is a weirder one though, as this is a remaster of a PS2 remake of a Game Boy Advance game, so it benefits in much the same way as the original Kingdom Hearts does. It looks a lot better on PS3. Now, these games would see release again in the future on other platforms, but the PlayStation 3 version is widely respected from what I can tell. It is certainly a packed release, that's for sure, and sets the stage for what's to come. While the remastering work isn't necessarily up to par with Bluepoint's best, it's still very good and earns a solid 900 out of 1080p's on the Full HD chart. In April, however, Vita and PlayStation 3 players alike were treated to the next game from Drinkbox. It's Guacamelee, and this one is truly a phenomenal production. After the Tales from Space titles, Drinkbox opted for a less linear design and tried their hand at creating a Metroidvania. Guacamelee follows the exploits of an agave farmer known as Juan, who is killed, sent to the land of the dead, then reincarnated as a luchador warrior on a quest for vengeance and love. The hook with this one lies in its wrestling-inspired combat and dual realities, which offers a more robust type of experience than typical Metroidvanias of this era. The game is expansive and beautiful, donning a slightly off-kilter but oh-so-stylish aesthetic, enhanced by strong animation work and richly detailed backgrounds. While their prior two games were certainly attractive, Guacamelee is a dramatic step forward, showing significant refinement in terms of realizing a coherent and unique vision. As a 2D side-scroller then, like certain other games in this list, Guacamelee delivers a full native 1080p presentation on PlayStation 3, and even a native 544p presentation on the PS Vita. With its angular designs and fine-grained in-surface detail, targeting such resolutions is a wise move that pays dividends with a very clean-looking game as a result. Furthermore, this is yet another 1080p native title that manages to deliver a smooth 60 frames per second during gameplay, which again is something I feel is critical for a side-scrolling action game like this. The fact that it does so even when the action heats up is key. So while it may no longer seem like a big deal to deliver a high-resolution 2D game, I maintain that it's something that deserves praise, as it certainly was not the standard during this generation of consoles, remember. Most 2D games were still ultimately just 720p. With its perfect mix of visual styling and smooth performance at Full HD then, Guacamelee comes in at 1065p's out of 1080. Not quite the best of the best, but it's darn close. Amazing work from Drinkbox. But the year of 2D would continue in July with the release of Vanillaware's Dragon's Crown. From the mind of George Kamitani comes an homage to Capcom's classic Dungeons & Dragons arcade brawlers, one of which he worked on. Dragon's Crown is a dark, quest-driven brawler with a ton of depth, multiplayer options, and of course that stunning Kamitani artwork. You can feel the love poured into its creation. You can always expect Vanillaware to shine when it comes to art direction, of course. It's true that the designs can be a little over the top, but I think it's a perfect fit for a game like this. The large, muscular figures and well-endowed cast members certainly dominate the action with serious screen presence. The game asks players to take on various quests in town, complete with a tavern, shops, a castle, and a guild, among other things. Once you accept your quest, you venture forth, selecting your next mission from a map so gorgeous it would make Jim Power blush. All of this is complemented by a super sharp presentation of Kamitani's art direction. The game outputs at a full native 1080p on PlayStation 3, bringing the artwork to life much as we saw with games such as Rayman Origins. It's an awe-inspiring piece of design work, honestly. I should note that other Vanillaware games would make an appearance on PS3, specifically Odin Sphere with its remake, but it doesn't benefit in quite the same way as Dragon's Crown when it comes to clarity. Now all of this is presented at 60 frames per second as well, which largely holds steady during the action. Yes, it's another 60 FPS 1080p game. Sure, it's 2D, but this is another great example of what a designer could create on this level of console hardware. Remember, the PS Triple was unfortunately rather outdated as of 2013, yet here we are, still enjoying games with visuals of this quality. So, as was the case with our last game then, I feel Dragon's Crown deserves a solid 1065 as well. Another sterling example of how to do high-resolution 2D gaming on this older generation of hardware. Guess what comes after Dragon's Crown though? Did you select another 2D game? If so, you're right, and this time it's Ib and Ob, a cooperative platform action game with a rather cute aesthetic. Ib and Ob almost reminds me of From Software's classic on PlayStation 2, The Adventures of Cookie and Cream, in that it assigns each character to one of two analog sticks on the controller, then asks you to manipulate both of them at the same time to solve platforming challenges. It's simple and fun, and yes, of course, it can be played in two-player mode as well. This one seems to utilize clean vector art, much like other games we've covered thus far, but it features a more sparse design aesthetic. I only have the demo in this case, however, but I was surprised by the quality of this game. It's really fun and clever. And of course, it also delivers 60 frames per second, so it has that going for it. It's pretty clear by now that the formula for delivering 1080p 60 on the PS3 had settled into the realm of 2D gaming by 2013, after many games attempted to pull it off in 3D earlier. I think I'll hand this one a smooth, clean 800 out of 1080p, just like Drinkbox's first game in fact. Not that this has anything to do with it. It's reasonably attractive, but not stunning. While the 2D train is rolling then, let's talk about Sound Shapes. This is the follow-up game from Queasy Games, the developer of Everyday Shooter, and it follows those same musical themes featured in that game. Except this time, it's a platform game. You control a small ball as you roll through the world screen by screen, hold the high-speed movement button to roll through the world, let go to stick onto certain surfaces, all while avoiding obstacles and adding to the beat. It is effectively a musical platformer, and it's brilliant. Not only does it feature a wide range of cool levels, each with their own musical tracks, it also offers a creation tool so you can make your own stages. When this game first launched, I followed its appearance on PlayStation Vita, which is where I played it, but the PlayStation 3 version is no slouch, offering a super clean 1080p presentation that is markedly improved over Everyday Shooter, which exhibits some aliasing. The smooth, flowing animation work matching the beat just feels fantastic even today, and everything of course updates at a fluid 60 frames per second with zero hiccups. Did you expect something less? The Vita version did have some slowdown though, so I suppose there was a chance for it here as well. Now, I was very generous with Everyday Shooter, awarding it 980 points. Sound Shapes looks even better, but at the same time, years have passed since that game released. Thus, I will award this one the same 980p's out of 1080. Our next two games, though, are perhaps a little more visually ambitious. First up, on August 13th, Way Forward made a return to the PlayStation 3 with a remake of the legendary NES title DuckTales. This is DuckTales Remastered, a game that's almost amazing, but falls just a little short as a result of a couple strange development decisions. The pitch is simple, of course: recreate and expand upon that original NES game using new visuals and music. One of the project's claims to fame is the reassembly of the original DuckTales voice cast from the cartoon, including the late Alan Young, who, despite his name, was in his 90s when he recorded the lines for Scrooge McDuck in this game.
I'm not even going to dignify that question with a response.
Alas, this is directly related to the remake's greatest problem as well: the cutscenes. So throughout the game, the voice cast is used to tell a story, which didn't really exist in the original game. Now that's all well and good, and the cutscenes are rather enjoyable at times, but they constantly interrupt the action on such a regular basis that it basically kills the game's pacing. Even with the option to skip cutscenes added via a patch, you still need to pause the game, then select skip it to continue. I'd have honestly preferred a separate no cutscene mode as an option instead. Still, if you can ignore that and just enjoy the cutscenes, what's here is pretty darn good. And there are even new stages included, along with optional improved controls, such as the easy pogo jumping. In bringing the game back to modern platforms, Way Forward opted for a 2.5D approach. The characters and enemies are all beautifully drawn, high-resolution sprites, while the backgrounds are full 3D with some 2D billboard elements. It's a different approach from many of the prior games we've discussed in 2013, of course, but I think it works rather well, and crucially, everything is displayed at Full HD 1080p, resulting in a very clean presentation. They also managed to deliver all of this at 60 frames per second, which is impressive given that it's not strictly a 2D game. Like Double Dragon Neon before, this one also features a phenomenal soundtrack by Jake Kaufman, featuring epic remixes of classic NES tracks such as this. So yeah, DuckTales Remastered is pretty good overall, and does well in terms of its 1080p-ness. I'd have to give this one a solid 1000p's out of 1080. But our next game is perhaps one of the most stunning titles we've examined today thus far. It's Rayman Legends, the follow-up to Rayman Origins. So this is a game I've purchased multiple times, as you can see, but I did not own this one on PlayStation 3. Thankfully, there's a demo, and that demo suggests that Ubi also did a great job in bringing it to the PS Triple. Now, this game was first pitched as a Wii U title, with multiple stages leaning heavily on the touchscreen functionality, but for the other consoles, Ubisoft adapted these sections, allowing more traditional controls instead, and it works better than I expected, but the experience is certainly different. Only those platforms with touchscreens get the touch element, as you'd expect. This time, however, the quality and depth of the artwork is pushed up to 11, with so much depth and detail throughout, so many layers of parallax combined with even more detailed bows and more polygonal elements even. It's just absurd how smooth everything runs in this game given how much is happening on screen at any one time. This is the Ubisoft I love and honestly miss. Legends also includes these phenomenal music stages which basically combine rhythm game concepts with platforming to great effect. Of course, Rayman Legends is 1080p native on all consoles, from Wii U, PS3, 360, up through PS4, Xbox One, and the Switch. Even the Vita version runs at its native resolution. It's really that good. The UbiArt framework is certainly impressive in what it delivers. Honestly, I can't say enough good things about this one. It's just so much fun and so beautiful to behold. And it also runs at a solid 60 frames per second. This is one of the best games Ubisoft has released over the last decade, by far, and one I simply cannot recommend enough. This is a masterpiece in my mind, to the point where I'm awarding it 1,200 Ps out of 1,080. That's right, this baby is super sampled and busts through the score ceiling with ease. Phenomenal work. But then, on November 13th, this happened. That's right, PlayStation 4 arrived, and along with it, a slew of launch games. One of those games, and one that went somewhat unnoticed, is a little-known title called Super Motherload. It turns out that this one also made the journey to PlayStation 3, and it's a fun little digging game. But the interesting thing about this release is the fact that it's basically on par with the PlayStation 4 version. No, it's not pushing any technical boundaries, mind you, but you get that same 1080p update at 60 frames per second, just like PlayStation 4. It's one of those curious things that you don't often see when a new platform is released. This kind of parity is remarkable in a sense. So while it's conservative in its design, I want to give this one 950 Ps out of 1080, just for bringing that PS4 experience to the old PS Triple. But there's one experience which probably should have made its way to PS4 as well. This is Gran Turismo 6, one of the last big exclusive PlayStation 3 releases to arrive for the now aging machine. This is pretty much the largest Gran Turismo game ever made, the game that seemingly pushed the studio so hard that it had to scale way back when building the follow-up. GT6 is gigantic in scope, just in terms of sheer volume of content. There's so much here. In fact, it's so large that I almost dreaded the capture session necessary for making this video. One does not just sample Gran Turismo 6, though I did try. But let's start from the beginning here, with the installation. GT5 already takes a long time to install, but GT6 is a whole new level. It might be the single longest installation process in the history of console gaming. It takes hours upon hours upon hours to complete a full install cycle plus update. Once you're finally in the game though, probably the next day, you'll be presented with a wall of potential content organized within the main menu. This time, the menu is more subdued compared to Gran Turismo 5, and as a result, more information is presented with less loading. So in that sense, it's certainly an improvement. In terms of overall content, GT6 has more than 30 tracks with many different variants, almost 1,200 cars, and just a ton of crazy different events, even ones on the moon. It featured online play, a course maker, up to 6 PlayStation 3s could also be connected for multi-screen action. It even features time of day changes on certain tracks as well as weather, and plenty of DLC on top of that. But the thing is, despite all this, and it being an excellent Gran Turismo game, it also feels like a game that arrived on the wrong machine. When Gran Turismo 6 arrived in stores in December, the PlayStation 4 had already been on the market for a month or so, and the aging PlayStation 3 struggled with performance in this game. Something we'll look at in just a moment. But this time, the resolution is actually boosted back up to 1440 by 1080 from GT5, which was 1280 by 1080, a 12.5% gain. But the multi-sampling anti-aliasing was dropped this time in favor of MLAA, the post-process variant that runs on the cell, which produces inferior results to my eyes, so it's kind of a wash. Polyphony Digital really pushes the PS3 hard with this one though, introducing things such as bokeh depth of field and greatly enhanced motion blur during replays with a much larger sample count than prior releases. The game can honestly look rather superb at times, especially on the city tracks, pushing way beyond Gran Turismo 5 in many aspects. And that's why I feel it would have made a great early PlayStation 4 game, even a cross-gen experience. Release this at native 1080p on PlayStation 4 with a stable 60 frames per second, and I think it would have been very well received, I'm sure. I mean, this was right near launch. Gran Turismo 7 was a cross-gen game this time around, and that happened more than a year after the PS5 launched. Fundamentally though, it just doesn't run well enough on the PlayStation 3 when using the 1080p mode. There's near constant screen tearing across the top of the image, and dips as low as the 40s, resulting in the least fluid Gran Turismo experience since the PS1 era. It's clear that the game really pushes the PS3 past its breaking point. The example we're looking at here though is just about the worst case scenario. Tracks with dynamic weather and dynamic time of day really struggle to maintain 60 FPS, rendering the 1080p mode almost useless in practice, I feel. I say that because in 720p mode, the performance is dramatically improved. You lose some clarity, sure, but even the most intense track situations now operate much closer to that stable 60 frames per second target, offering a better gameplay experience all around. It makes it a whole lot more enjoyable, that's for sure. It's a shame they ditched the MSAA in this mode, but it's interesting to look at what was achieved here. But the situation around its release is interesting because Polyphony Digital is one of the very few developers that released PlayStation 3 games across the system's entire lifetime. It was there right near launch with Gran Turismo HD. It produced multiple iterations of GT5 and then dropped this one last game right after the PlayStation 4 was already out. There is a clear evolution in terms of visual features, however. Environment detail is ramped up dramatically, lighting and shadows become more robust and in some cases fully real-time. Effects work is improved, car models receive a ton more detail in addition to actual cockpits starting with GT5 Prologue. But it's also clear that none of this comes for free, and by the end of the generation we go from that stable 60 FPS experience with GT HD to a wildly unstable GT6, packed with screen tearing. But at the same time, it's not really apples to apples either. If you run that GT HD track in GT6 in a time trial, it's perfectly fine and runs very stably. It's only when you start to add in multiple cars and real-time lighting that things get out of control, and GT HD never even attempted it. The fact that their first and last title both delivered results at 1440 by 1080 then is perhaps most interesting of all. We really get to see the limits of what the PlayStation 3 could deliver. So yeah, that's Gran Turismo 6, the last big AAA release for PlayStation 3 from a first-party studio. And as I said, it's very, very good, but it falls short in terms of overall performance. So when considering the full HD score for this one, I think we have to take that into account. Given the ambitions then, I have to give this one 780p, the highest score of any Gran Turismo game today. The performance may be lacking in certain modes, but it's an impressive package. Despite the arrival of next generation, PS3 had a great 2013 when it comes to 1080p games, with a final result of 931p's out of 1080. As 2013 came to an end, the days of PlayStation 3 were also nearing an end. PS4 was the new hotness and PS Vita was still relatively fresh, though its end was coming soon too, sadly. But that doesn't mean things were completely over for the PS3. As the PS4 generation got started, the age of cross-gen began, and many games would continue to arrive on PlayStation 3. Unfortunately, most of these conversions were extremely poor at best. After all, by this time, it wasn't really worth pouring huge engineering efforts into the aging PS3 versions, was it? Thus, it's no surprise that 1080p content started to dry up. That doesn't mean there weren't some games, however. So I guess the first game to mention for 2014 is none other than Final Fantasy X and X-2 HD remasters. Technically, this came out at the end of 2013 in Japan, but everywhere else in 2014. And it's an excellent remaster of a classic RPG, and amazingly, the PS3 version offers full HD 1080p support in addition to a 720p option. The difference here is that 1080p lacks any form of anti-aliasing, but 720p uses FXAA. Furthermore, textures, pre-rendered backgrounds, and other assets were all cleaned up and enhanced in this version, while the soundtrack was fully remixed and improved as well. They then added real-time projected shadows into the mix rather than circle shadows as seen on PlayStation 2, plus other improved effects. Of course, the models were also updated for the main characters, and not everyone loves these new models, but I think it works well enough in most cases. And all of this applies to both Final Fantasy X and the included Final Fantasy X-2. Yes, the dancing and bombast of the follow-up to Final Fantasy X is fully intact and presented in glorious Full HD 1080p. Just look at this. Much like Kingdom Hearts then, the game remains capped at 30 frames per second and has mostly little trouble maintaining this on PlayStation 3. It is not 100% flawless, as there are occasional minor disruptions along the frame time graph. Nothing too serious, however, as the 30 FPS is by and large fully achieved in this mode. The only real disappointment here is that they didn't aim for 60 FPS, but given its roots on the PlayStation 2, it's entirely possible that that would have required work beyond the scope of this project. Oh well. Still, it's an excellent example of a remaster and a step above the work done on Kingdom Hearts HD 1.5. It also received Vita and PlayStation 4 ports, by the way, which are also excellent. So given all that, I give this one a solid 975 points out of 1080, as it offers an excellent 1080p experience that is worthy of Final Fantasy. After this, in May, the world was treated to a little game called Sports Friends, a mix of multiplayer titles cobbled together into this neat little package. One of the primary highlights for me anyways is the tremendously entertaining
Johann Sebastian Joust,
a game that doesn't even really need an image on the screen at all, ironically. You and your friends all hold Move controllers, and the goal is to get them to move the controller just enough that it knocks them out of the game. It's really fun. The other games are also entertaining and, as the name implies, a lot of fun with friends. And of course, while this game is not focused on high-end visuals by any means, what is here is all presented at a pristine native 1080p with super clean vector artwork throughout. Again, it's just another example of how a simple concept like this can utilize the extra pixels to great effect. On top of that, it's also 60 frames per second, just like the PlayStation 4 version. It's not a technical powerhouse by any means, but I thought it was worth including. Since visuals are not the main focus though, and it's rather conservative technically, I think I'll award this one 750 out of 1080. Then, in June, Drinkbox returns with a follow-up to Tales from Space with Mutant Blobs Attack. And this one first arrived in 2012 on PlayStation Vita, but the development team then opted to port it over to the PlayStation 3 as well, and the result is fantastic. Essentially, just like their other games, Mutant Blobs Attack offers a full native 1080p presentation using super clean vector artwork again that allows the camera to scale in and out effortlessly without compromising clarity. I also feel like the art design is more refined compared to the first entry, and the level design more enjoyable. As a Vita port, however, some concessions had to be made. Specifically, the touchscreen segments are now mapped to the right stick with L1 toggling between the various objects. It works, but is certainly less natural comparatively to using the touchscreen. Still, you get that same perfect 60 frames per second experience once again, just like prior Drinkbox releases, so it feels great to play. Honestly, their games are a real treat, very well made technically. Every single Drinkbox title is a strong example of how art and technology can work in tandem to create something truly polished. With these improvements then, I'd like to give this one 950 Ps out of 1080. It's better looking than the first game, but not quite on par with Guacamelee. Still, a worthy release for the PlayStation 3. A couple months later then, the world was treated to, this. Yeah, so this is Ho Hokum, and it's something. So you basically drop into this strange, two-dimensional, possibly drug-fueled world piloting a long snake-like creature around, and of course this creature is delightfully known as the Long Mover. There's no obvious objective though, rather you fly around these various stages and zones, triggering actions and finding ways to proceed through the game. It's basically a game focused on relaxation and just enjoying the moment. But the presentation is superb. It features razor-sharp 2D artwork, something I feel like I've said at least 30 times today, and it runs at native 1080p, like many other games on this list. There's no aliasing or edges to be found anywhere. The intended design is perfectly realized and executed here, and it all moves at a rock-solid 60 frames per second as well. Another 60 FPS title. In fact, at the end of this video, I will reveal just how many games we've covered today that actually run at 60 FPS. I think you'll be surprised. So yeah, given its stunning yet bizarre presentation, I have to award this one the full 1000 out of 1080. It's a beautiful game. We're making real progress here though, almost to the end guys, just hold on. Next up is the second Kingdom Hearts release. This is Kingdom Hearts HD 2.5, and you guessed it, it's a package much like Kingdom Hearts 1.5, an HD re-release of Kingdom Hearts 2 and Birth by Sleep plus recoded. So Kingdom Hearts 2 is once again a PlayStation 2 title that has been converted and enhanced for PlayStation 3. The HD rework is very similar to what we saw in the last game and generally excellent. It delivers similar image quality results with dynamic resolution scaling up to native 1080p. Birth by Sleep though is a little more fascinating for me as it's a conversion of a PSP game that was released in 2010. And it's one of the finest looking games on PSP as well, I'd argue. A real technical powerhouse. And the HD version feels like a faithful and improved adaptation of that. The whole package is very well done, but doesn't necessarily take things quite as far as we saw with the Final Fantasy X HD collection, so I feel it deserves the same 900 points as the first released Kingdom Hearts game. Now, this was pretty much the last major 1080p game for 2014 that I could find, and it was a strong one to end on, but from this point, the PS4 is truly the main focus of most publishers, and there wouldn't be that much else that fits the criteria of this episode. With just 5 games on the list for 2014, however, this one comes in at 915p's for the year. Now in 2015, there was at least one other 1080p native title to mention, a game known as Tennis in the Face. It's a cute little puzzle game focused on hitting a tennis ball and slamming as many people as possible on the way to the goal, which is not bad. A wild concept for sure, and certainly fun, and yeah, it delivers 1080p output at 60 FPS as well. Can I say razor sharp 2D again? Because yeah, it has that. But I'm not necessarily a fan of the art style, and it is a very simple game, so I'd probably have to give this one 650p's out of 1080. And with this being the only game on my 2015 list, that means that's the score for 2015 as well. Are there other 1080p titles though? I'm sure there might be. In fact, I was surprised by just how many games made it to this video in the first place. We're over 80 now. I think it's about time for that summary. With that, however, the PlayStation 3 would begin to fade away, becoming relegated to the past. The PlayStation Store on PS3 was updated to match the current generation hardware, but unfortunately in doing so, the performance faltered. Just browsing the store became a chore, and some of the features didn't even work anymore. It was just slow, choppy, and increasingly non-functional. Over time, many games would be delisted, and Sony even threatened to pull the plug on the whole thing at one point. Yet, amidst the rubble, the PS Triple stands strong. Over the course of its life, the PlayStation 3 would amass more than 2,500 games, which is honestly a huge amount. And during the course of this video, I think I managed to sample most 1080p games for the system. Not necessarily all, but hopefully most of them. But if we're generous with those numbers, it's safe to say that just 3 to 4% of the PlayStation 3's library offers 1080p rendering. So let's break down the data we've collected today. Firstly, which year offers the best 1080p games? Based on the results accrued over the course of this video, which were very scientifically calculated using my opinion as a basis, the award for the best year of 1080p goes to 2013, the year of PlayStation 4. Yeah, the rise of beautiful 2D games, HD remasters, and, well, Gran Turismo means that it comes out on top, but 2007 and 2012 are very close. You can really see the evolution over the lifetime of the system, with the first 2 or 3 years focusing primarily on bringing 3D games to the 1080p space. 2009, 2010 were somewhat lacking in total number of titles, but then the rise of indie games, 2D games, and HD remasters meant that the latter years of PS3 were actually packed with some great 1080p examples. But there's another interesting factoid buried within. For this video, I featured 85 games running at 1080p, or at least partially 1080p. Of those, 60 games run at 60 frames per second. A fitting and impressive result, I think. So what does this mean? Well, I think it kind of supports my point from the beginning of this video series, that budgeting your resources around a target frame rate and resolution early on in the project pays off big time in the end. Even on an underpowered system like PlayStation 3, 60 FPS and 1080p are possible in tandem, and I think this is something that developers can take forward to modern systems as well. Where does that leave the 1080p dream then? What was that original marketing all about? Well, it's pretty clear that it was not the standard. It was never going to become the standard, but at the same time, while 3% may not seem like much, the reality is that, given the hardware, I was actually surprised and impressed by the sheer volume of 1080p titles available for the system. In that sense, PS3 has a much larger library of full HD games than Xbox 360 and Wii U combined, which was kind of surprising to me, I have to admit. With that though, hopefully you've enjoyed this journey through the life of PlayStation 3. Despite its many missteps, I feel like this year has marked somewhat of a resurgence for the system. I was all too happy to leave it behind back in 2013 when the newer machines arrived, but looking back, it still has that spark of classic PlayStation 1 and PS2 era Sony that has mostly disappeared in modern times. So perhaps against the odds, Chad was right all along and the PS3 really is as ballin' as possible.